Welcome to the one-on-one podcast. This is the Occult Book Club review with the rabbit hole master one-on-one himself and me, Paranoid American. Today we're covering a book called The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon.
So it's actually three. It's a study, right? And it's three different books in one, technically. So
It's a short. I mean, when we say 3 books, it seems like that would
yeah,
be a lot of pages, but the whole single compilation of all 3 books is like 130 pages or so.
130. I got 221 here on my
I mean,
ebook.
I mean, I've got a printed one here, but there's ones you can find on archive.org, and they're all. I mean, it's the same book.
Yeah, dude, it was so. Before we get into it, I always forget. Plug your shit, Thomas.
Oh,
Or
right.
plug mine.
So, ParanoidAmerican.com. I've got some comics on there, all kinds of occult and conspiracy theory based comic books, all sorts of topics, free to read. And if you really like it, you can go on Amazon and search for Paranoid American books and get some printed copies. And what's it? Paranoid American on Instagram.
Awesome. The one-on-one podcast on all social media platforms. Make sure to follow the Patreon, patreon.com/the one-on-one podcast, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, YouTube, all that shit. Rockfin.com/the one-on-one podcast. We got Telegram. Join on there, talk shit, whatever. It's a fun time. And yeah, let's get into this shit. So the Occult Book Club, we're at it again. We're covering The Crowd, a study of the popular mind by Gustave Le Bon. He was a French. Was he a philosopher or a philologist? I forget.
A philologist, I think he
Right?
was. No, he was a psychologist, although he started out with archaeology
Social
and
psychologist.
anthropology, and then he got into, sort of social psychology. Yeah.
Yeah, so he was born 1841, died 1931. He was a French social psychologist, and this is written in 1895, so 5 years before Nietzsche died, before Nietzsche kicked it, bro.
Yeah, so he was a contemporary of Sigmund Freud and Nietzsche and
Mm-hmm.
sort of that whole movement. He was a contemporary of it all.
So do you want to hear my favorite line in this entire thing? And
I
and
mean,
we
is
can.
it going to be like a big spoiler alert? Are you going to steal my favorite line? Go ahead.
No, I don't think so. I
Yeah,
think
what was your favorite line? And are you saying in the first book or in all 3 books?
in the first book.
Okay.
And this is crazy. You're not gonna believe this. I
I
thought I
think I already
highlighted
know
it.
which one it is.
I thought I highlighted it and I didn't.
Is it about the Unreal?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you have that quote?
I've got it pulled up if I could steal it from you.
Yeah, that's fine. That's my favorite part. I just want to get to that, and then we're gonna be covering it pretty much in order because I think he presents it really well as far as the first two paragraphs, and this is public domain, so anybody wondering, you can find it online anywhere, and we can read right off the whole thing. It's not going to be anything with copyright, so I felt that we can cover the main two paragraphs and the first parts of the chapters, and then go based off of that because I took plenty of notes, and we're gonna have plenty of stuff to talk about. So yeah, go ahead and read that quote for me, bro.
All right, so this is in I think the introduction, or at least in like one of the very early parts of the first book. And the quote that I know that you were going to bring up is, in certain cases, there's more truth in the unreal than in the real. To present objects with their exact geometrical forms would be distort nature and render it unrecognizable. Now I'll cut it off there because we can read the whole context in a little bit.
Dude, the entire time that I was reading this thing, I was flabbergasted, right? I like that word, flabbergasted. Because, dude, the guy is spitting some shit. The guy is spitting some stuff. He's shooting shots. So, shots fired. Shots fired. Stand by. 1 second. Right?
Shots fired! Shots fired!
He is going at it, bro, to whoever. So this was towards the end of the 1900s. There was turmoil.
1800, towards the end of the 1800s.
I'm sorry, 1800s, early 1900s, and there was turmoil in this time. So, but a lot of the stuff that he was talking about, we can definitely relate it to things that are going on today. And when you really start to break it down, and dude, they call this guy, he is known as the father of crowd psychology. Now, this piece of work rubbed a lot of people the wrong way, and once we get into it, you can see why. But there hasn't been anything else at this level that's been written about this. And he also wrote, I think, The Psychology of Revolution. Was that the one? He also wrote some other stuff.
He wrote that one, and one of his first works was something about like the psychology of peoples. It roughly translated to that. But The Crowd by far was his most popular work.
And, you know, when it comes to studying people, dude, it's always fascinated me because when you really break things down to such a like microscopic level, you really start to connect the dots as far as why things mean the things that they mean to certain people and why people act a certain way towards things. And it's almost nihilistic in a sense, because if you strip all the symbolism away from something, if you strip everything away from it at its very core, it's bullshit, bro. Like it's nothing. It's all simulacra. And I would love to do the Simulacra and Simulation by Jean Baudrillard.
Very nihilistic of you.
It is, right? And the more
it's very nihilistic.
I have that side of me too, bro, where I go, you know what? Sometimes I'll be doing research, dude, and I'll be 100% honest with you. I'll be like, what am I doing this for? For a fucking podcast? For what?
You know what kind of analogy I always bring up in my mind when I'm doing something like that? And even if it's something even dumber, like I'm playing video games for an hour or something, and it's like, man, what am I just sitting here wasting my life away, you know, pushing bits around and pixels on the screen that ultimately mean nothing at all. But I always like to remember those like Tibetan monks that go up in the mountains and they make these like huge intricate sand mandalas, and then once it's perfect and all the colors are like absolutely in line, they just fucking wipe it off and start over again. So, I mean, I'm not equating myself to a Tibetan monk with like enlightenment or anything, but I kind of feel that same ephemeral quality of just like studying whatever you're interested in the moment, or playing that game, or just wasting time and watching TV. I don't draw a huge difference between that and sort of that same kind of concept of just acknowledging that everything's temporary.
Yeah, right. Life is temporary, bro. All this is temporary. And here we are making comic books, Thomas.
Are you going to drop that now?
Yeah, I've already talked about it on the show. I mean, it's not
Okay.
it's not a secret anymore. I mean, I've been posting the concept art on social media, but here we are working on grown-ass men working on comic books, drawing ourselves and hiring artists to do stuff. And here we are reading books about crowd psychology.
Inspiring creative endeavors along the way. I mean, that's what other noble cause is there other than inspiring other people to be creative?
Absolutely. So I'm trying to get here. Let's get into this real quick. So I wanted to start. Did you want to start off with the introduction? Anything that stood out to you other than that main quote, which was in the introduction?
Well, you wanted to go with the first couple paragraphs, I guess, of like page 1, and that's exactly what I've got highlighted too. So if you want to start there, you can
go ahead.
I can read it.
Go ahead and read it. Yeah, I don't have it highlighted. I have some other stuff in the introduction highlighted, but we can just work our way through this.
All right, so I'm just going to go for the very opening paragraph, and then we'll kind of reflect on some of the things that it brought up. And I've got like a whole bunch of different highlights all over the place, so I'll just read the whole first paragraph. So he starts out and he says, "The great upheavals which precede changes of civilization, such as the fall of the Roman Empire and the foundation of the Arabian Empire, seem at first sight determined more especially by political transformations, foreign invasions, and the overthrow of dynasties. But a more attentive study of these events shows that, behind their apparent causes, the real cause is generally seen to be a profound modification in the ideas of the peoples. The true historical upheavals are not those which astonish us by grandeur and violence. The only important changes, whence the renewal of civilization results, affect ideas, conceptions, and beliefs." And he goes on with more language here, but I mean, from a conspiracy theorist standpoint, he kind of spells out here that there's this workings behind the scenes that's actually innovating these changes, and that people like to think that it's politicians and wars and sort of like these national movements, but really it's kind of the mentality of the people in masses, And this is gonna lead directly into this psychology of crowds, where the crowd has all of this power that has never really been seen before.
And right after that, dude, I actually highlighted the memorable events of history are the visible effects of the invisible changes of human thought. Did you read that?
I need a little sound effects thing for like damn, that was deep or something.
Hold on, I got you.
Finish it.
I don't know. Whatever, dude. I
Yeah,
have
so-
I have the hype here. I mean,
we need some more hype. There we go. But yeah, I mean, again, he says this in so many cool ways, and I'm going to point out a few different ones. But like you said, that the memorable events of history are the visible effects of the invisible changes of human thought. And
that's deep, bro.
that blows my mind, man. And it's even deeper when you consider, again, this dude's writing it from the 1890s.
That's what I'm saying. And before we get further into it, Thomas, can you let people know who this inspired? Like whose libraries was this in? Because it's a very influential piece of literature throughout history.
Yeah, we were talking about this on the side, and the whole reason I think this book even came into my sphere is that I was doing research into like authoritarian rulers, and it got into how they were inspired by Edward Bernays, and that Edward Bernays himself was inspired by this book, The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon, and that this book was found on all sorts of bookshelves of actual rulers like Mussolini, and I think Hitler was a huge proponent of this book. And it's not necessarily because it espouses any sort of like crazy ideals. It is quite literally a handbook. It's a manual of like, here's how you control large amounts of people with very little effort. And it's almost like this, is it Tai Chi or is it like Taekwondo, where like you use the opponent's energy against them as opposed to like delivering powerful, punches and kicks.
It's like
you kind
jujitsu,
of like
yeah.
you like redirect their energy, and I absolutely read this book as a way to do that. It's like this crowd-based jujitsu of, okay, the crowd is going to develop and harness their own energy, and you can just help direct it in ways and flows. And if you're actually standing in a situation where you do have crowds of people under you, this doesn't just become a novel, thought experiment and a fun book to read. It literally becomes an instruction manual.
Yeah, and that's scary because if you can literally write, like I said earlier at the beginning, this fascinates me because you can literally break it down. And later on, he compares people to automaton, which is something that Tesla talked about, something that even Descartes talked about, which I find like it's like the coolest word, automaton. Like, what is, and then it's broken down. We'll get into that a little bit later. But the next line on that is it's got just one line. The present epoch is one of these critical moments in which the thought of mankind is undergoing a process of transformation. And then it has two fundamental factors are at the base of this transformation. The first is the destruction of those religious, political, and social beliefs in which all the elements of our civilization are rooted. The second is the creation of entirely new conditions of existence and thought as the result of modern scientific and industrial discoveries. So, yeah, when I was reading through this, I was like, how is this guy? And mind you, the first, I was listening to a lecture on this, and there was a guy who apparently he spoke French, and he said, because this is a translated work, so the one that we're reading in English is translated from French. And the guy that was giving the presentation on Le Bon, he talked about how he read the original French version. And he says that the original French version has a whole different just depth to it. Because when I'm reading this, I feel like the guy has like almost like a snarky type of tone. Like, you guys are all idiots.
It reads very clinical too. It's very matter of fact. Like,
yes.
Like later on in the book, he'll just be like, oh, and if you try to apply this to an Argentinian versus someone from, Berkshire, then it won't work on this group of people, but it will on this group of people. But the way that he writes it, it's just like, A equals 1 and B equals 2, and there's not even like a debate about it.
And there's a touch of racism in it, a touch of sexism. So sexist, he talked about women like the most, one of the lines was like the most emotional people in society are like women and children. Like they give off the most emotional response, and it's like, wait, what? Damn, that's kind of.
Well, and he starts to describe certain crowd psychologies as being that of a woman, which is, I mean, it's part product of his time, but it reflects on his whole sort of philosophy in this book. In my mind, was taking these complicated individuals and realizing that if you put two individuals together, that new organism of those two individuals as a group isn't necessarily like all the complexities of the two people combined. It's all of the most simple aspects of them combined.
Yes.
And then if you get 100 people and combine them together, you don't have 100 times the complexity. Now you're just looking for like the lowest common denominator, like everything that these 100 people have in common. And if it's only three things, well, now your group is essentially has the intelligence of being, cognizant of three things. And I mean, that's oversimplifying it, but that's essentially his process here.
So I want to read this next line here. The ideas of the past, although half destroyed, being still very powerful, and the ideas which are to replace them being still in process of formation, the modern age represents a period of transition and anarchy. And, we're talking about knowledge. We're talking about knowledge that's being passed down through generations. And he's talking about like, hey, the stuff back then is still pretty good, but the stuff that's coming now, it's even more innovative in a way, right? It's presenting all these new things and bringing forth these new points of views. And I have here one of the lines that really stood out to me because it's all about the cancel culture that we're experiencing now. It's all about this mass psychosis that we're having now. The age we are about to enter will in truth be the era of crowds. And that's on the end of the next paragraph.
Yeah, actually, let me rewind because I've got a statement that he makes right before that. It to me it sounds like if you were reading this in context, it was like a Reddit post from 2022. You'd be like, oh, there's some boomer complaining about the new generation. But it says, it says, while all our ancient beliefs are tottering and disappearing, while the old pillars of society are giving way one by one, the power of the crowd is the only force that nothing menaces, and of which the prestige is continually on the increase. And he's saying other things around this passage about how like this is about to cause the downfall of society, and people aren't going to respect each other anymore, and that we're going to revert back to like a primitive state because we're entering this era of the crowd. And immediately after that, he makes this statement, and I had to read this thing over like 3 or 4 times, and then this clicked because it's so far removed historically from us. But he mentions, and again, this is 1896 that he's writing this, and he's thinking back to 100 years before. So now he's thinking back into the 1700s, which for someone writing it in the 1800s wasn't that crazy. You know what I mean? I think back to like the 1940s is essentially the equivalent here. Like World War II. So Gustave thinking back to the equivalent of his World War II, and he says right here, and again, this absolutely blew my mind, that scarcely a century ago, the traditional policy of European states and the rivalries of sovereigns were the principal factors that shaped events. The opinion of the masses scarcely counted, and the most frequently indeed did not count at all. Today, it's traditions which are used to obtain in politics, and the individual tendencies and rivalries of rulers which do not count. On the contrary, it's now the voice of the masses that have become the preponderant. So he mentions that 100 years before he's writing this, crowds and individuals had nothing to say. They were serfs, essentially. Like they were still moving out of that middle-aged kind of serfdom dynamic, and that no one really... Like he is so forward thinking here, and he realizes like, okay, if the old way of like having these individual rulers that have command over large crowds, if their influence is going away, the only thing that's going to fill up that vacuum is the crowd itself. And holy hell, now that dynamic is going to completely flip, and now the masses have the control and not the rulers. Or so you might think if you don't follow the rest of his instructions.
And did you know what was actually emerging at the time of his writing this, bro? Do you know what was coming out, what we see today, what really resonates with everyone? The newspaper was the main media of the time. So you had the newspaper coming out with articles, propaganda, whatever it was, and really starting to influence the crowd, this crowd mentality. And so you can see where right before we had the newspaper, then what was the radio, then you had the black and white, then you had the regular TV, and now you have the internet with everything that's encompassed in that. And we literally have the amount of information that we have at this very second in time right now at 6:59 p.m. April 12th, 2022 is more information than we've ever had since the beginning of time ever. I think it's like I saw this quote the other day. It was like, you have more information in 5 minutes than somebody had in their entire lifetime, like the 1700s or something like that, like some crazy.
I'll just point out we're talking quantity, not quality at this point.
Well, that's subjective, Thomas. I mean, you could say that, for a lot of people, the mainstream narrative and the mainstream media is the truth, is nothing but the truth. So help me God, and they're gonna run to it, and we're gonna get to why that is later on. So I have the entry of the popular classes into political life. That is to say, in reality, their progressive transformation into governing classes is one of the most striking characteristics of our epoch of transition. And then I have here the introduction of universal suffrage, which exercised for a long time but little influence, is not, as might be thought, the distinguishing feature of this transference of political power. And universal suffrage really stood out to me because what do we have now with these cancel cultures, right? And people know what I'm talking about. I'm talking about BLM. We're talking about Antifa. We're talking about all that shit because this
You're
is
just
relevant.
still mad that Roseanne got kicked off her own show. You're still mad about it.
What?
That was like the epitome of cancel culture, no? When Roseanne Barr got kicked off.
I don't even know who that is.
Oh, I forgot how you're like 10 years separated.
I don't give a fuck about any of that stuff. What are you talking about, Roseanne? Which one are you talking about? Explain.
So Roseanne Barr was a fairly famous comedian in the 80s and 90s, and she had a show called Roseanne, literally named after her. Mm-hmm. And then it went away for, I don't know, like a decade, and then came back. It had like this 2018 reboot or something like that. And it was her and John Goodman. I mean, it was like really popular show in the day. It was about this middle class like family that, like stretching to make ends meet and having to run odd jobs and stuff. And she tweeted a picture of some politician next to Planet of the Apes screenshot because Helena Bonham Carter in makeup looked vaguely, similar to this like actual lady. I forgot her name. It was like Valerie something. And anyways, cancel culture came out immediately. And within like the week, I think, she got kicked off of her own show. They renamed the show to the Connors, which was the last name. And then they made her OD on opium, I think. And she died on the show from an OD, opium overdose. But I mean, that was like, I don't know. I was making a horrible joke that didn't land because I forgot you're like 10 years removed. But
I don't watch a lot of TV either, bro. Like I there's people who love the show Friends. I don't like that show. all these weird shows that.
Well, Roseanne was kind of particular, especially for like the crowd that gets offended by cancel culture. So like you've got like the Bible Belt sort of like blue collar hardcore followers of that particular show, because at the time Roseanne, I think, was like the only middle class. Like every other house on TV, they were going to like a mansion and like they all had like nice cars.
Friends,
kind of like
Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, right?
Or Friends. Like Friends is another great example, right? Like they all have like shitty jobs, but they live in like downtown Manhattan or something with like a really nice high rise. But anyways, that caused a whole bunch of stir. I'm surprised you hadn't heard of it, but I'm also not that surprised.
No, so I mean, I know about cancel culture, but more of the, I can't really think of anything, but we have here related to this, because the more I read this book, the more I saw today, right? And mind you, this is at the early 1900s, late 1800s. I'm like, is this dude writing today? Like, is he trolling people from today? Today, the claims of the masses are becoming more and more sharply defined and amount to nothing less than a determination to utterly destroy society as it now exists. As it now exists. Jeez. Woo. Let's try that again. Today, the claims of the masses are becoming more and more sharply defined and amount to nothing less than a determination to utterly destroy society as it now exists, with a view to making it hark back to the primitive communism, which was the normal condition of all human groups before the dawn of civilization. Wow, that was embarrassing. But again, you're starting
he makes
to see...
his stance fairly known here about what he thinks about communism as a political theory for sure. I mean, he likens it to just straight like the primitive anarchic state of being at like the dawn of civilization, and that anything that strays from communism or builds on top of it is automatically an improvement. That's essentially his passage here.
The divine right of the masses is about to replace the divine right of kings. Bro, when I read that, I was like... Again, it was just phrase after phrase after phrase of stuff that is resonating with me. Science promised us truth, or at least a knowledge of such relations as our intelligence can seize. It never promised us peace or happiness. What's happening right now, Thomas? Oh, I want to identify as this. Well, science never said that you were going to be happy, bro. Science is science, and science is saying the other thing. But the way you the way you feel. This is what this guy's saying. Like, you know what? Fuck the way you feel about something. The science is the science. That's the truth. That's whatever it is. And that's what's happening today, bro. I mean, you see it, how people are wanting to, like right now, bro, like one of the things that I'm going through, I have kids. They're teaching kids about sex at 4 or 5 years old, about wanting to identify as something or this. It's like, bro, they don't even know what cereal they want to eat. And you want to tell me that they want to identify as a toaster or something, and they're going to make that choice. And they're at schools telling kids, hey, don't tell your parents. But if you feel like, you know, you're something else, then it's okay. You can tell us, but don't tell your parents. What kind of fucked up shit is that, bro? You know what I mean? Like, what kind of crazy ideology is that you're going to, you know, let kids talk?
If you want to go on a whole different tangent, but I'd firmly believe that in the education system, there's almost an intent, and it might be like a subtle, like the crowd psychology style intent, not like an email you get in your inbox that says, you know, do these things. But there's almost this aspect of teachers pitting their kids against their parents, because they look at both of them with some disdain. They look at the parents with disdain because how dare you send these kids to school, like I'm just a glorified babysitter. And then unless the kid is like an absolute perfect student on day one, there might be some disdain for the kid itself. So there's this really weird toxic dynamic, I think. And I've got a chip on my shoulder because I went to public school, and I can count, you know, the good teachers I had on like 2 fingers.
Mm-hmm.
But I really do feel that they're like, there's this concept of injecting themselves in because they realize they can kind of change society by you know, getting at them when they're, you know, like as some religious folks might say, like, you got to get them when the skull's still soft so you can like get that information in there, you know.
No, absolutely, dude. Absolutely. What you're saying is 100% correct. I mean, get them before they're fully you're indoctrinating them. You know, before anything else gets to them, that's what you're doing. You're injecting your ideologies into these young adults that are not adults, children. These children.
When it's the most formative years of their lives, and in these cases where it's the teacher, I mean, this teacher represents the only adult authority source of information. So
for a better part of the day.
For a better part of the day. And even if you disagree with the teacher, which is probably rare in younger grade levels, but as you get older, even if you disagree, like, you could legit get in trouble for, you know, starting problems by just saying that you disagree with something. So there's also this like top down, listen to whatever I say, that's the rule mentality. And as we all grow up and get older, we realize that, like, back in your youth, every adult that said something that was pretty sure of themselves was probably full of bullshit. Like, they didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't have their lives together. I mean, it might have been this 38-year-old social studies teacher that made you go and fucking sit in the hall for the rest of the week, but like she was probably fucking getting drunk off of her, you know, her little whisk in the side closet. So
So at the very beginning, at this introduction of this book, he really gets into what he's going to get into. And one of the things that stood out to me, history tells us that from the moment when the moral forces on which a civilization rested have lost their strength, its final dissolution is brought about by those unconscious and brutal crowds known, justifiably enough, as barbarians. Civilizations as yet have only been created and directed by a small intellectual aristocracy, never by crowds. Crowds are only powerful for destruction. Now we're getting into some lizard talk, Thomas, by a small intellectual aristocracy. Jeez.
This comes up a number of times. This almost this exact same statement, word for word, just slightly rearranged. And this has a huge reflection too in like how America was founded, 1776, and even towards like the concept, for example, of the Electoral College, which is a long, boring concept, but essentially it boils down to this exact thing that originally
democracy.
Someone realized, well, it's not pure democracy, right? This is the republic aspect of democracy.
But
like, where you
the
have
democracy is ruled by the crowd, by the nation, by the people.
No, so but what he's saying here is that if you allow pure democracy, the crowd will just result in destruction. That they're
so
not
check
gonna...
this out. The next line here, in consequence of the purely destructive nature of their power, crowds act like those microbes which hasten the dissolution of enfeebled or dead bodies. Now,
yeah, I imagine the image. Everyone's seen the video of like the fox that like dies in the forest, and like the ants in the mold like just make it like turn into a skeleton in seconds.
These crowds, they hasten, right, the decomposition and he says when the structure of a civilization is rotten, it is always the masses that bring about its downfall. It is at such a juncture that their chief mission is plainly visible, and that for a while the philosophy of numbers seems the only philosophy of history. Whoa.
Yeah, that's that might makes right philosophy.
Holy shit, bro.
But I do want to point out that I don't want to skate over that little mention of the small intellectual aristocracy that he's saying here in plain language that if you don't want your civilization or whatever you're running, if it's your company or your political party, if you don't want it to just completely collapse and eat itself, that you essentially need this small intellectual aristocracy to guide the crowd and prevent it from just ultimately resulting in destruction. So this is like having someone at the reins up on high. This is that elite, those lizards, the Illuminati, the Council of 12, whatever you want it.
Illuminati confirmed.
There you go.
Damn, Daniel.
What?
But he's saying
fuck?
like you need that group to exist in order to prevent society from eating itself alive.
Yes, exactly, because they have. Here we go. However, in point of fact, all the world's masters, all the founders of religions or empires, the apostles of all beliefs, eminent statesmen, and in a more modest sphere, the mere chiefs of small groups of men have always been unconscious psychologists, possessed of an instinctive and often very sure knowledge of the character of crowds. And it is their accurate knowledge of this character that has enabled them to so easily establish their mastery. And he gets into Napoleon, right? He gets into I think a couple other people in history where some people weren't able, and we'll get to it, some people weren't able to be manipulated a certain type of way because of their race, because of where they were from, their cultural differences. So, and that's where he gets into, hey, for the Spaniards or the Anglo-Saxon, I think he talks about the Anglo-Saxon and the Spaniards, I think people in Spain, this will work on them, but it won't work on these other people because these people value X, Y, and Z. And these other people really don't care all about that. So you got to keep that in mind. And mind you, the reason I bring this up is because the most famous rulers, and I'm not going to say greatest because they were pieces of shit, but you have Mussolini, you have Hitler, you have all the biggest pieces of shit in history. They probably had this book in their library. Some
Or
translation.
and what Gustave Le Bon is saying here too is that even if they didn't, although the guys you
They
mentioned probably
understand.
did, yeah, even if they didn't, they understood this, and they might have just been born with this ability and didn't realize like why why is it so easy for me to become a captain and a general and a president? Like, why does it just keep falling to my lap? And he's kind of explaining that it's because they intuitively understood this knowledge of crowds. And he goes on to actually say, and then if they understand the difference of like the ethnicities and the histories of the people, and he does emphasize that it's about like the national history more than like a racial group, because it's about like the previous conflicts that their fathers and their grandfathers might have gone through that sort of imprinted themselves on them as they grew up, through generations. They might not realize why they hate a certain type of person or a certain people from an area, but it's probably baked in from some kind of historical aspects that they're just not aware of.
So as we work our way into, that was the introduction. As we work our way into chapter 1, wow, 35 minutes in, we have what is a crowd, right? Because this is what the crowd, the psychology of crowds. Let's fucking get to it, Juan and Thomas. Just fucking do this. Right, we have here, what is a crowd? Le Bon defines a crowd as a group of individuals united by a common idea, belief, or ideology. Unlike philosophers, crowds accept ideas superficially and utilize them as fuel for their revolutionary action. According to Le Bon, when an individual becomes part of a crowd, he undergoes a profound psychological transformation. He is no longer an individual within this crowd, but rather becomes an automaton. An automaton is derived from Greek and translates to self-acting. An automaton, and automata is plural, is an abstract self-propelled computing device which follows a predetermined sequence of operations automatically. And there's also automata theory, which is a whole other thing. But Le Bon writes, we have here, he is no longer himself, but has become an automaton who has ceased to be guided by his will. Okay? And you can see an individual becomes a pawn who sacrifices his personal goals for those of the crowd. And I have another quote. In a crowd, every sentiment and act is contagious, and contagious to such a degree that an individual readily sacrifices his personal interest to the collective interest. So that's the mentality of, that's what he defines a crowd as. So we have almost, and he gets into it, he calls it like a supernatural force, which I know you don't like the woo stuff, Thomas. I know you're not into magic and stuff.
I have to accept it on my terms.
But it's
like I don't like the word magic just because it lumps in everything from David Copperfield to to like
Magic with a
actual
K.
magic to it just lumps in too many things.
It's magic with a K, Thomas, because
Okay, thank you.
at the end of the day, there seems to be something supernatural, something that just takes over. Have you ever looked into like mass hysteria? Like when people just fucking go. There's like been people who laugh to death in history. Have you ever read into all those things? Like these things.
Although I tend to think that a lot of those are like psychedelically induced and not necessarily just pure mental phenomena.
You think so?
I do. I mean, the few that I've been interested enough to look into, there's just as much evidence that there was, for example, a contamination of ergot that got into like their wheat supply for the entire town. There's some cases where there's been actual government intervention that spiked, villages' water supplies with psychedelics just to see what would happen. And a lot of these things get, kind of glossed over as like, oh, it was a mass hysteria event. But my skeptical conspiratorial sense is like, yeah, that's the cover story, my friend. Like there's a reason why everyone went into mass hysteria. But I understand the concept. I don't want to derail you. I understand the concept of mass hysteria.
And I'm trying to connect here because so we have not every group of people is considered a crowd, okay? But if they meet the criteria, they are. So I'm the whole time while I'm reading this, I'm just thinking to myself, I go, am I part of a crowd? Am I
you've got the podcast crowd. You've got, if you go to a PTA meeting, now you're in the parent crowd. You go to your kids' soccer games, you're in a crowd. These are all, if you're in traffic and there's like one asshole driver, and even though you're not communicating with all the people driving around you, you can tell when like everyone knows that, like, they know that there's an asshole driver on the road. Well, now you're in a crowd, you know what I mean, of people wielding dangerous objects.
Because he writes here, in its ordinary sense of the word, crowd means a gathering of individuals of whatever nationality, profession, or sex, and whatever be the chances that have brought them together. From the psychological point of view, the expression crowd assumes quite a different signification. Under certain given circumstances, and only under those circumstances, an agglomeration, I've never even fucking heard that word before.
Agglomeration.
Mm-hmm. Of men presents new characteristics very different from those of the individuals composing it. So what you mentioned earlier, right? They become its own organism, right? This whole, well, it's just a blob.
And I think this is the key to this entire book. If you walk away with one form of understanding, at least to me, it was that, like, my estimation, you get 10 smart scientists in a room, right? I imagine that room just got 10 times smarter. Now it's like 100 times smarter than one, non-scientist.
Yeah.
But really what happens is those 10 scientists get in a room and they collectively get dumber in many ways. Because now they're at the will of the crowd and the human element of, like, maybe I've got the right answer, but if, what's the, like, 9 out of 10 dentists agree on, like, a toothpaste, right? But that one dude, like, maybe there was 2 dudes or 3 dudes that disagreed. But once that sort of aspect of, like, oh man, I'm in the minority now, I don't want to ostracize myself from the crowd. So you start feeding into it. Just like you said a second ago, that individuals will start to sacrifice, their own well-being and their own reputation, their own standing for the sake of the crowd. And it's not always out of, like, an altruistic feeling of, like, let me give to the crowd. Sometimes it's like, oh shit, I don't want to get kicked out of the crowd. I gotta be in this crowd. So whatever it takes, I'll bend a little bit to stay in here.
The sentiments and ideas of all persons in the gathering take one and the same direction, and their conscious personality vanishes. A collective mind is formed, doubtless transitory, but presenting very clearly defined characteristics. The gathering has thus become what, in the absence of a better expression, I will call an organized crowd, or, if the term is considered preferable, a psychological crowd. It forms a single being and is subjected to the law of the mental unity of crowds. So he kind of puts parameters onto what can be considered a crowd. But what you said, dude, I mean, I'm thinking about what you just said about the scientists. Like, is the quantifying power, right, multiplied, or is it dumbed down to the smartest person in that group? Because,
well, if it's a crowd the way he's describing a crowd in these terms, it gets dumber. By very definition and nature, 10 scientists that form a crowd in this context get dumber because, and as we'll figure out as we go through this, but he likens crowd consciousness to leaning more towards a reaction of emotions and reactions to, again, like that superficial, like that surface description of things. And that rationality and deep discussion and, like, hey guys, let's take, a 5-minute break and really think this through. That concept doesn't exist in the crowd. The crowd favors immediate, impulsive reactions every single time. Almost never is a crowd going to say, yeah, let's take a 30-minute break. The second the leader takes a 30-minute break, a new leader will kind of sprout up and take control of that crowd. And it's the way that he writes it here. He's just saying, like, this is just a matter of fact. You just have to accept that this is how crowds work, as he's defining it, as a psychological crowd, and to go with the flow. And the rest of it is like, here's how you control it once this happens.
I love the way that he puts it here. So, special characteristics of psychological crowds: the turning in a fixed direction of the ideas and sentiments of individuals composing such a crowd, and the disappearance of their personality. The crowd is always dominated by considerations of which it is unconscious. the disappearance of brain activity and the predominance of medullary activity, the lowering of the intelligence, and the complete transformation of the sentiments. The transformed sentiments may be better or worse than those of the individuals of which the crowd is composed. A crowd is as easily heroic as criminal. And the crowds that we've had as of lately are pretty fucking criminal, especially those Trumpers, right? Those Trumpers that get together and they start doing stuff. Those are the bad people. Never forget. That's right. The insurrection and all this bullshit. But again, I had never really thought about that crowds have their own psychology and until I really started digging into this. And when I was reading about Jung and Freud, I thought for a second, I'm like, man, I want to start studying psychology, but fuck all that, dude. I mean, that's just a lot of material to really, you know what I mean? Like, who are you to dictate what somebody?
What scares me the most about getting deep into psychology is not how much you have to read, but how much you have to unlearn. And then after you're done with the studies, like not everything you read is going to be totally applicable. So you have to like unlearn that too. So it's like a two-way street, right? It's like if you go on a long jog, like you have to keep in mind that you have to run back home too. Like it's not just when you get tired, you stop.
Did you have anything else in chapter 1 that you wanted to point out? Because I have some stuff on the influences and
I've got a lot actually, but you covered a whole bunch of it here to here. But I've got some passages that I think are worth reading through. So he says in one of these that thousands of isolated individuals may acquire at certain moments and under the influence of certain violent emotions, for example, a great national event. January 6th, right? So, for example, this great national event, the characteristics of a psychological crowd. It will be sufficient in that case that the mere chance should bring them together for their acts at once to assume the characteristics peculiar to the act of a crowd. And this, in other words, the way that I kind of read this is that, you know, January 6th, well, I'm going to use January 6th since you brought it up. It might not be the best example, but this, you know, fully is crowd mentality, people making decisions that they wouldn't have if they were in like groups of 2 and 3, but once they get into these huge massive crowds that have the power to like overpower and influence, you know, cops from like moving out of the way and stuff, they make different types of decisions. But what he's saying here is how that crowd can be teachers, and it can be protesters, and it can be violent militia people, and it can be old grandma with her Polaroid that's just there to take pictures of the Capitol. That like they can all get just the fact that they all met on chance and they happen to have one thing in common. You know, they all were interested in being there on January 6th. That one commonality supersedes the fact that, you know, this lady's a grandma and this guy's a militia guy. Like they're essentially, you know, hand in hand walking into the Capitol building because they all were under this same sort of crowd influence. And again,
spell. Go ahead, say it, Thomas.
Spell. I mean, yeah. So I will fully submit that I believe in this kind of magic for sure.
What kind of magic is that, Thomas?
Just the fact that you can have this like sentiment rise non-verbally almost, and perpetuate enough through a crowd that it creates a national event that then the entire world talks about for years to come and gets cited in books. Like these huge movements that just kind of start with a small burst of energy that propagates and reverberates and gets bigger and bigger. I mean, to me, that's alchemy, right? That's taking this small amount of energy and turning it
as
into
above,
a huge
so
amount
below.
of energy.
Yeah, the Big Bang. The Big Bang opened up, and you have the universe, and then, like you said, this little, I like the way you put that. Makes my nipples hard, Thomas, where you said, you know, this little bang of energy, boom, like this little to kickstart it. And it's funny how that works, right? When you're in a place where you know other people share the same ideology as you, like, you know that one meme where the guy's like, you know, when you're like in a crowd and you look over at somebody. Have you ever been part of? I mean, I don't know if you could say it, but have you ever been part of a civil unrest? Have you ever done some shady shit? I'm sure you have, because you're part of the secret societies and stuff. Yeah. And this is why you're studying this sort of book.
I have never. I've always been a completely upstanding citizen that's contributed to society in positive ways.
Now, if you weren't in the armed forces or in the military, would you say the same thing?
No, I mean, honestly, I can't think of a time that I've been in like a crazy crowd like that, but I've been in like I guess the most tame example would be like a mosh pit at like a small concert. And if you start pushing a little bit harder and then start throwing some elbows and maybe throwing some headbutts in there,
Grabbing
then
some dicks. Yeah, nice.
other people start playing in, and now they're headbutting and throwing elbows, and all of a sudden, this tiny little catalyst turns into like, oh man, like someone got seriously hurt. Now the show's getting canceled. So I mean, in that sort of an aspect, although I wouldn't say it like a big public unrest. Like I'm much of a conspiracy theorist that I feel like I can't join anyone's cause. What was the quote of like, I wouldn't join a club that would have me. I kind of have that same mentality, so I find it hard to get passionate. When I see other people getting really passionate, I'm like, oh shit, this might be a Gustave Le Bon crowd moment. Let me back up and see how this plays out,
Fuck this shit, I'm out. You fucking just like leave.
Well, and honestly, I mean, jokes aside though, to me, this is like the most powerful reason to even read this kind of a book, is that once you read this and you see even if you don't agree with how this works, like this is an instruction manual how other people think that it works. Yeah. So once you see these mechanics in play and you recognize it, you can be like, oh shit, I'm in a crowd right now. Or like, oh man, that looks like a psychological crowd that's forming over there. Let me, keep my distance, or let me, adjust my strategy or my behavior likewise. And just having that foresight alone is worth reading, 100 pages of a book. Absolutely.
But how many people are going to take the time to read some work like this, Thomas? I mean,
well, you get it on, get it on audio tape and you listen to it while you're fucking smoking your bong or whatever it is that you do.
So yeah, ladies and gentlemen, make sure to read your, open up to page 150 of The Crowd by Gustave Le Bon, and we're going to read passage number 1, line 35. What are you doing, bro? Are you flipping through what I'm telling you?
I've got the book here, man.
No, but I'm not. I'm just fucking kidding, bro.
No, I'm moving on to the next page here because I got another passage from chapter 1 here.
I thought you were like flipping to what I'm telling you. I'm like, what are you doing, dog?
My book doesn't go that high. So he just kind of describes in this first book many different ways of describing this crowd concept, and in hopes that the reader like latches on to one of them. And I'm guilty of this too, where like I might explain the same fucking concept like 4 different ways just because.
Yeah, I felt that while reading this book. It was like the same idea over and over again a little bit.
Absolutely.
Like, yeah.
But he's just trying to, like, I guess in his mind, he's like, oh, well, Juan might be in the Puerto Rican group, so he's not going to get the first 3 explanations. He's going to get the 4th one when I mention, like reggaeton or something. He's going to latch onto it then. I mean, but like, I think that's kind of the way that he's doing it, is that he understood how sort of revolutionary this work was, and he probably felt it was important enough to just drive this concept. So another way that he drives this in different language is he says, whoever be the individuals that compose it, however like or unlike be their mode of life, their occupations, their characters, their intelligence, the fact that they've been transformed into a crowd puts them in possession of a sort of collective mind which makes them feel, think, and act in a manner quite different from which each individual would think, feel, or act if he were in a state of isolation. And again, we're just repeating the exact same stuff over and over, but he's driving in this point that when you become into a crowd, whoever is listening to this, talking to you, when you join a large crowd of people that starts to have like an opinion or like a motive of some kind, you haven't gotten smarter, and if anything, you have forfeited some of your individuality to this crowd, whether you like it or not, as long as you remain part of that crowd. And also that like the movements and the decisions that crowd makes, from you being in that crowd, you're at like, you made that decision with them. You kind of provided the power for it. And unless you remove yourself from that crowd and it starts to dissipate, eventually all of these decisions become your own, and you'll find yourself, making bigger and bigger risks, because that's what the crowd's been doing. And you kind of like, this might also be before your time a little bit, but like the 1990s of like Star Trek Generation and shit. No, but of like the Borg, which was this like one mind. And if you became part of the Borg, you weren't an individual. You kind of joined like every other Borg in the universe. And the Borg was like this kind of connected through like a neural network AI. So if you joined them, you kind of became like hive mind, you forfeited all of your individuality.
That's scary. Because
I mean, to some people, but also it's comforting because it's like, it's giving up your personal responsibility and handing it over to the crowd. And as long as that crowd maintains power, like even the fucked up things that you're doing don't really have the same repercussions as they would if you were an individual. You know, like looting is a great example of that.
But here's the thing, dude. He does make he puts parameters on that where I think he gives an example, or I think it was the person that was giving the lecture that gave an example of like, if there's this riot going on and somebody, you know, falls unconscious or loses their wallet or some shit like that, like some people would either take that wallet or some other people would just put the wallet back where it was, you know, on the person if he's unconscious or whatever it is. You know what I mean? It's like, in a way, like, remember, it's a living organism, so it's going to react at the time of when this is happening, and sometimes it's not all bad. I'm not trying to get here that all groups are bad, because you do have these groups that, right? I mean, one example that just comes right off the top of my head is like the whole Martin Luther King Jr., the march that they did, where it was for civil rights, you know, it was for...
Yeah, well, he's, I mean, this is in the very first paragraph of the first chapter, and he ends it with, a crowd is as easily heroic as it is criminal.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So he makes it clear, but I think that underlying that still, like, even those heroic acts of the crowd, they're done from a much more primitive, baser instinct. It's like these heroic acts aren't necessarily being done from rational forethought. And I think the danger of that is that a heroic act and a criminal act sometimes are like, it's all depends on how you're affected by that thing happening. To some people, you know, that was a heroic thing of breaking the fucking CVS window with a brick, and to other people it was, you know, a criminal thing or heroic. So like I feel there's some depth, but when you mention that, like someone losing their wallet inside the crowd, I would say that that's not necessarily like, because the crowd isn't focused on that one person losing their wallet. I doubt a crowd forms around finding a wallet.
Fuck this guy.
You know, yeah. the crowd is formed around some other motive. So like, sure, the guy loses his wallet and like a couple people help him out, whatever. But like that's completely separate from this like organism of the crowd. I'd almost liken it to, you know, a human being a single organism. You get an infection or something. Well, okay, some white blood cells and things like go and attack that specific local site.
I get you.
That doesn't change your goal of like, no, I'm driving to get a burger right now. Like I don't care that I got this cut on my elbow in the process. You know, I kind of see it in that same way.
I love the way you break that down, Thomas. Damn, dude, you should start your own podcast, bro.
One day. I gotta let everyone else rise up first.
What else you got in chapter 1?
I'm a sucker for when it gets like all scientific and starts breaking things in science terms. And like when it gets more clinical, I don't know why, I just computer programmer, I just kind of like fall into understanding it better. So he mentions at one point that just as in chemistry, certain elements when brought into contact, bases and acids, for example, combine to form a new body processing properties quite different from those of the bodies that have served to form it. So now he's comparing individuals to chemicals, and you combine them, and again, it's like it's not an aggregation of the two individuals and all of their you know,
it's the reaction.
Characters. Yeah, dude, it's this new thing that gets formed, and you might not know what that thing is.
It's a homunculi, bro.
Well, a homunculi is, I think you've got a little bit more control over what comes out of it, because you know what's going into it. But this is a way of saying that, like, you get, you know, me and Juan into a room, you get someone else into a room, like, the crowd that forms, maybe not between two people, but the types of crowds that can form just because of who comprises them can be these vastly different creatures with totally different characteristics. I don't know, that kind of blows my mind in a way, because it's such a deep concept. It's like this concept of like infinite possibilities, you know, combine like all these different versions of like, what if I took those 3 people out and put this one person over there? How does that affect the crowd?
Oh, man.
I would love to be able to, like, you know, from up sky alien ant farm, just be like, okay, that turned into a riot and people started looting. What if I put like, you know, these guys in that group? And then what happens? You know, it's just like
it's like the Freemasons form when you put Juan and Thomas together, but then when you take Thomas out, the Freemasons break away. And then, so let's put this other guy in here to see what the fuck happens. Yeah, it is that. It's a science experiment, bro.
And I got a couple others. I got 3 others to wrap up chapter 1. So he says, the conscious life of the mind is of small importance in comparison with its unconscious life, the most subtle analyst, the most acute observer, is scarcely successful in discovering more than a very small number of unconscious motives that determine his conduct. And he has this other really great analogy. Let me see if I can find it. Yeah, so he says, and this one I think it was equally as deep as that, like sometimes the unreal is realer than the real quote. So he mentions that perceptible phenomena may be compared to the waves, which are the expression on the surface of the ocean of deep-lying disturbances of which we know nothing. And again, this is like, yeah, give it another one of those. But he's saying, like, I love this visual. I'm a very visual person. So he's describing, like, you go out into the ocean and you see these waves moving around. Like, those waves are not just from the wind brushing across the surface and, like, the things that you see. Like, that one little wave pattern might be affected by, you know, like 800 feet, a mile down underwater. There's something happening that's resulting in the shape of these waves.
The lizards.
The lizards are down there, you know, whipping it up. But and I love, my favorite part of that quote is where he says, "Of which we know nothing." Like, he doesn't pretend to know, like, what all the different factors are that plays in. Like, he was humble enough to say, like, "Hey, this thing's at play, but I don't understand it, but I know that it's there."
That's why I'm saying, like, in the midst of all this stuff, at its very core, it's this unforeseen, unintelligible force that we don't know anything about. That it's like almost like it has this Lovecraftian aspect to it all. Where again, this is during his time too. You know, I mean, Lovecraft, the early 1900s. It's this force that's just running everything and just makes me think of, again, like an angel or like a Metatron, like controlling, you know, coagulating. And I know you don't like that shit, Thomas, but you know what I mean. This, I like to think of it that way. And I saw a lot of things in here where at its core, it's like, yeah, this is very scholarly. This is very multidisciplinary, and like it's a very, you know, scholarly approach to the subject. But then Homeboy throws in these things. It was like, yeah, we don't, you know, I mean, we don't know what this is, but it's something, you know.
I mean, I honestly love his approach to all this too. It's kind of funny because in the beginning of the book somewhere, he self-describes this book as like the first objective and non-subjective take on psychology of crowds. You get a couple paragraphs in, and it's
communism.
Like, yeah, and he's like, Anglo-Saxons be like this, and fucking Spaniards be like this, you know. So he obviously didn't follow that completely all the way through, but those aspects of like the historical national identity, separating the reactions of how those people form crowds, like he put some thought into it. And I also think that this was a period of time when he mentioned that a lot of power came from the top down. It came from principalities and from, you know, like rulers that were commanding how society lived, and that the crowd hadn't quite yet taken full control over. Like, this is on the cusp of the Industrial Revolution, and the, you know, America had only been around for maybe 100 years at this point. So this was, you know, really, really forward thinking.
And it makes me think right back to the beginning where he's talking about history, right, and all these ideas. And, you know, he's rubbing shoulders with Nietzsche. And one of the things that Nietzsche brought forth was perspectivism. And perspectivism, because he's talking about not coming from a biased point of view, but perspectivism is that we're all comparing each other's perspectives, and no one ever sees anything for what it actually is, an unbiased point of view. And mind you, he's rubbing shoulders with this guy. I'm pretty sure he was reading Nietzsche's work and like putting, you know, so it makes me even think that history itself is some sort of psychological crowd, if you really think about it, because these previous influences and these previous ideas are influencing what we have today. And it's just, again, an amalgamation and just ever evolving. It's like this rolling blob. Like I sometimes visualize, you know, reality as this blob that's just trying to come together to form a homunculi. You know what I mean?
you gotta give yourself a hype hit on there. I need my own soundboard eventually. But I love that, man. I never considered that.
Daniel. What the fuck, y'all got?
Because we're talking about.
This is my brain as I'm reading this stuff. Where I'm like, damn, bro. I'm like 2 a.m. reading this. I'm like, damn.
Well, because we're talking about crowds, and my mind never strayed from like people in the same area, or at least living at the same time, right? Like a crowd might be a Reddit forum where everyone just fucking dogpiles on some topic. Like that's a perfect example of a crowd separated by space. But man, through history, that's another good example where you could have people that all just kind of file in line behind some sort of historical ideology, and that itself is like this historical crowd.
And to add to one quote that I missed to add to this whole thing, it is crowds rather than isolated individuals that may be induced to run the risk of death to secure the triumph of a creed or an idea, that may be fired with enthusiasm for glory and honor. Such heroism, without doubt, somewhat unconscious. Such heroism is without doubt somewhat unconscious, but it is of such heroism that history is made. So, in a way, he's also like tipping his hat off to people in crowds too, to actually bring forth change. I mean, because
maybe
a crowd leads to revolution.
So I'm still thinking of this not in like he doesn't tip his hat or wag his finger at any point. The way that I read it, is he just matter of factly stating that heroic actions that we're used to typically don't happen just in an isolated event, like an individual shows up and performs this heroic action. There's obviously examples of all sorts of variations of that, but when you're in this large crowd, the individual might be more susceptible to taking risks and thinking that they're a little bit more powerful than they are, because they've got, this adrenaline pumping, and they've got a crowd of people cheering behind them, and they know that everyone's on the same page and they're supportive of whatever they do. So maybe they're gonna, throw a punch at that police officer and do this heroic / criminal action, depending on your perspective of it. And that wouldn't happen if it were just like one dude walking up to a police officer, you know what I mean? But if he's got a crowd behind him, now all of a sudden that decision-making process doesn't factor in the same things.
It overrides it, yeah.
And you mentioned perspectivism, and this is actually from this is the sentence immediately leading up to "there's more truth in the unreal than the real," and he dives directly into perspectivism. So I want to read this part off. And to me, I was just thinking Platonic solids as I was reading this, and he obviously was referring to this. But he says, from the point of view of absolute truth, a cube or a circle are invariable geometrical figures, rigorously defined by certain formulas. We're talking geometry right now, Pythagoras, right? And we're saying that this perfect cube and this perfect circle are fully defined. We know the math that makes them up. We can describe them from any angle. But we're going to see in the rest of the statement, this is almost assumes that it's a perfect circle. It's a cube before you look at it. Because if you don't know that ahead of time, it might not look like a perfect circle from your perspective. So you wouldn't know about that absolute truth. So the way that he describes this, he says, from the point of view of the impression they make, and this is the cube and the circle, from the point of view of the impression they make on our eye, these geometrical figures may assume a variety of shapes. Spam.
How unprofessional of you, bro.
By perspective, the cube may be transformed into a pyramid or a square, and the circle into an ellipse or a straight line. And moreover, the consideration of these fictitious shapes is more important than of the real shapes, for it is they and they alone which we can see and that can be reproduced in photography or in pictures. So this is him saying that you have to know that the actual sphere and the cube do exist out there, but it doesn't matter. And it doesn't matter that those are the truth, because if you go around telling everyone, hey dude, that thing that you're looking at, that's not a line, that's a sphere. You're just looking at it from the side. You got to tilt your head and then it becomes a sphere. But what the fuck you talk about, bro? I'm looking at it right now. It's a line. There's nothing that's going to change. If I turn my head, it's not going to make it a line. So this concept, this one just kind of blows my mind. And if you get really deep into it, it's not just this literal line versus a sphere. If you consider the Platonic solids, because now it's the difference between an absolute perfect square versus something that you might find in nature, which is not going to have perfect edges and round, straight corners. You're going to always have these little flaws. We're living in this Gnostic creation of the demiurge, so we don't have perfection here, but we understand what that ideal is and what the pattern is. And the reason why this tangent is kind of important is that I also think that you can think of the crowd in this way, where like he describes these facets of a crowd, and great, that exists if they're like this perfect, ideal version, abstract that we're coming
But
up
it's
with.
not.
But there's always room for that human element to throw a wrench in the works.
Yeah, and like the people on the outside are going to be seeing like, wait, I don't like that motivation, but I like this aspect of it because they're looking at it from this side of the room. And then the people on this side of the room see the other things that the other person pointed out that they liked actually, but then they, you know what I mean? So and this is where I can see, because Baudrillard was later on and he talks about simulacra, and that, the whole idea, the actual shape taking more importance than the idea. That's simulacra, where we're giving importance to these empty symbols versus the actual thing. You know what I mean? Like, hey, you're giving importance to this religious artifact, this statue of Jesus Christ. It's not Jesus Christ, but for some people that is Jesus Christ. You know what I mean? Like, because that's the way that they view it. They've been so indoctrinated that they start to adopt that thing as a real saint, as a real figure, when in actuality it's just a symbol of what they want it to be. So again, we have Plato influencing Le Bon, and then Le Bon probably influencing, Baudrillard. So you see this timeline, right? Maybe Nietzsche was influencing Le Bon too. So you have,
well, the big one is Edward Bernays too, because Edward Bernays was related to like modern day propaganda, and he had this philosophy of that if you just repeat a lie to enough people enough of
start to
time,
believe
this
it.
big masses, you can create, like, you can make the falsity the truth and the truth the falsity just by public perception, and that public perception matters way more than the truth does, and it can survive longer than the truth can.
Yeah, and I pointed this out earlier because, again, even this, the Republic is also just how this book is a very influential piece on two separate people, the Nazis and then Martin Luther King Jr., like two different polarizations, which that's also part of the psychology of crowds. What do you have on chapter 1 so we can move on to the...
So yeah, the last quote that I got here, which is one of my favorite ones, so let me see if I can find it here. Dude, I'm telling you, chapter 1 is just loaded with like quotables, and we could go on forever and ever on this.
I would have highlighted the whole fucking thing.
Yeah, I feel like that too. Okay. He says that, and this is in the context, this is again where I was mentioning like a grandma and a school teacher can form a group with a militia, and now they're in like the same crowd with the same motivations. So this is a quick statement on sort of emphasizing that. And he says, from an intellectual point of view, an abyss may exist between a great mathematician and his bootmaker, but from the point of view of character, the difference is most often slight or non-existent. And again, this is saying that a fancy way of saying that like they're both two dudes. They both bleed red, and they both fart, and they both fucking get sick and have all the same human flaws. And just because one guy might be this academic genius with 10 years in the field and prestige and awards, like if you put these two people in a crowd, they're not that much different from each other. Like you remove them from what makes them different, and you've put them together in what makes them the same. And you can almost be guaranteed that the thing that makes them the same is not going to be 10 years of prestige. It's going to be some more baser, common, simple sort of rudimentary emotional instinct.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you read the whole quote, because I remember that one also standing out to me, and I really like that because, again, it shows the polarity, the fictitious polarity that society really imposes on hierarchy, right? Like, oh, I'm better than you because I'm more prestigious than you. I have more money than you. So automatically it's like, nah, at the end of the day, bro, you're not that different than each other. Just because you got more commas in the bank account doesn't mean really anything. At the end of the day, when you strip away that that individuality and you put it in a crowd, y'all are the same people. You know what I mean? You're just another.
I'm not going to try to quote the exact thing, but there's for Skull and Bones, right?
Of course.
They've got this big portrait with 4 skulls on it, and there's some German saying that they adopted from perhaps like the Bavarian Illuminati, but the saying roughly translates to something about like a king and a pauper and a beggar and a madman. I'm making those things up. They're essentially like, try to point them out in this picture, and it's just 4 skulls. And it's like saying like, great, whatever they accomplished in life, doesn't really matter because
they're
here they are.
skulls
They're,
now.
they're all just skulls now. They're exactly the same. They have no more merits between each other. And it's in the skull and bones context, this is a reminder of how insignificant you are in the tome of history. You know, it's like watching those videos that show you like how small a person is compared to like the entire solar system, and then the galaxies beyond that, and then the super galaxies beyond that. Like you're more infinitesimal than like the smallest piece of like a grain of sand. So it's another way of saying that, but again, like back in the context, it's saying that we're also insignificant in the way that we kind of like relate to each other, that these crowds just kind of form inherently.
Absolutely. And I have here, let me see, I gotta make sure that my battery doesn't die on my tablet. We have Le Bon. So we have chapter 2, the sentiments and morality of crowds. And Le Bon argued that a crowd forms when an influential idea unites a number of individuals and propels them to act toward a common goal. Although these influential ideas are never created by members of the crowd, but are instead brought into the world by the minds of great individuals or influential, since those who are part of this crowd are mediocre. They are incapable of understanding those ideas in their original state. So for this influence to happen, the idea needs to be broken down for the crowd to understand. And I have a quote here. It says, ideas being only accessible to crowds after having assumed a very simple shape must often undergo the most thoroughgoing transformations to become popular. It is especially when we are dealing with somewhat lofty philosophical or scientific ideas that we see how far-reaching are the modifications they require in order to lower them to the level of the intelligence of crowds. However great or true an idea may have been to begin with, it is deprived of almost all that which constituted its elevation and its greatness by the mere fact that it has come within the intellectual range of crowds and exerts an influence upon them. So we can pause there because we said a lot. Okay, we have here this idea that to ignite a crowd, it all starts, I think we mentioned at the beginning, it all starts with this idea from the lizards, from this aristocracy, from these higher intellects. But to them, this idea is this crazy complex thing. So I don't have an example to kickstart this breakdown, but it makes perfect sense because but then he says that people in these crowds are barbarians, they're mediocre, they can't really think for themselves. So you take this idea and it's like a game of telephone. You break it down so again, not to be mean, but the dumbest person or the lowest person of intellect in that crowd can understand it or
Absolutely.
pretend to understand it. Because have you seen all these videos, bro, where they interview somebody? Why are you here? Well, I really don't really know. I'm just here because there's a lot of people who just cling on to that.
Well, there's a good explanation for that, and it fits directly into what we're saying here, and that's that. Let's imagine like a spectrum from the most complex idea to the most simple idea. So in this example, let's say the most complex idea that this crowd gets behind is the entire Communist Manifesto. You know, the entire written works and all of the intricate details. But you're not going to show up at a crowd that's chanting and where people have all sorts of different motives and just start reciting word for word out of the Communist Manifesto. You're going to lose all of them. Mm-hmm. So what eventually happens, and again, this is like an oversimplified version, but that, you know, Communist Manifesto approach might essentially result in a crowd and all they're chanting is whose streets are streets for, 4 hours as they go around through a city. But it's essentially like the motivation of this Communist Manifesto, communist thinking that results in that crowd being formed. And then as they organically figure out like what's the highest level of thought we're capable of, and in one instance it might just be whose streets are streets and marching up and down and hitting cars and stuff. I mean, that might be as advanced as that crowd is capable of performing. And the problem there is that if they were to go any higher, then they lose a whole section of that crowd falls off. You know,
Yes.
if they elevate it to like, hey guys, let's not just chant and
Down
rant
with the
and break
Jews.
things.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
You got that
And
Homer Simpson meme where he goes into the hedge.
Well, then the scary thing of that too is that once someone says something crazy like that, someone that wasn't in that crowd might be like, oh, did someone just say, you know, something really ignorant? And they kind of like wander in, and now they're part of the crowd, and they might have just lowered the IQ of the crowd even more. And what Le Bon kind of says here is that there's not a critical mass when you add like another person and the crowd gets a little bit smarter. Like every time you increase the size of a crowd, it only gets dumber, or it plateaus. It never ever increases in complexity. It never asks for more philosophical debate. If anything, it caters more towards chants and slogans and like very easy to like repeat songs that rhyme. Like these are the things that crowds tend to, you know, really adopt.
And I have here impulsiveness, mobility, and irritability of crowds. The crowd is at the mercy of all exterior exciting causes.
This is the exact the exact quote that I have highlighted too.
And reflects their incessant variations. The impulses which the crowd obeys are so imperious as to annihilate the feeling of personal interest. Premeditation is absent from crowds. Racial influence. 2. Crowds are credulous and readily influenced by suggestion. Suggestion is very important because we're going to get into that later. The obedience of crowds to suggestions. The images evoked in the mind of crowds are accepted by them as realities. Why these images are identical for all the individuals composing a crowd. The equality of the educated and the ignorant man in a crowd. Various examples of the illusions to which the individuals in a crowd are subject. The impossibility of according belief to the testimony of crowds, the unanimity of numerous witnesses is one of the worst proofs that can be invoked to establish a fact. The slight value of works of history. 3, the exaggeration and ingenuousness. Did I say that right?
Mm-hmm.
Ingenuousness of the sentiments of crowds. Crowds do not admit doubt or uncertainty and always go to extremes. Their sentiments always excessive. 4, the intolerance, dictatorial, man, fuck this.
But that's a really important part right there that you covered. That
go ahead, read number 4 for me, Thomas.
well, hold on. Did he saying that? Okay, the intolerance, dictatorialness, and conservatism of crowds, the reasons of these sentiments, the servility of crowds in the face of strong authority, the momentary revolutionary instincts of crowds do not prevent them from being extremely conservative, and that crowds instinctively are hostile to changes and progress. And you mentioned another thing too, that crowds essentially don't even acknowledge doubt. Like they're incapable of doubt, because doubt, again, a doubt represents, like, you know, you've got this momentum, like we're marching towards something, you know, we're getting to the Capitol. At no point does the crowd collectively stop and be like,
wait, hold up, not that,
wait a minute.
not that,
yeah,
though.
yeah,
not that.
Yeah, let's think about this. Is this a bad idea? Like, nah, bro. Like the momentum that's building, like that fuels the crowd to just
don't go
keep
into the
going
Capitol
until...
building. That looks like a bad idea. No. Fuck this. We're going balls to the wall.
And this is a good lead into the next line that I kind of underlined here, and it says, and keep this in mind, right? This crowd that's like moving almost out of control. It can't stop for reflection. It can't acknowledge doubt. And Le Bon says, a crowd is at the mercy of all external exciting causes and reflects their incessant variations. This is what you mentioned. And this again is like the crowd at a certain point, it's so malleable and so easy to manipulate that all it takes is someone to see, oh, there's a crowd over there, like I can go and stir shit. And you see this, I mean, you could probably see in certain crowds where there'll be like a person that's not necessarily involved in it, like, oh, you gonna let him say that, bro? You know what I mean? Like those dudes that are like trying to start a fight with somebody. But this is a perfect example. If you got like a whole bunch of, you know, guys that are all aggressive and like someone's ready for a fight, all it takes is for some guy in the back like, yo, throw a punch, bro, throw a punch. And then bam, that catalyst is there, and yeah, you gonna let him say that, you know?
I remember, bro, it's like being in high school all over again. Like that's how fights got started. Like, damn, bro, you gonna let him do that to you? Oh,
Well, now apply crowd mentality to high school age, right? So if you acknowledge that a crowd is only as smart as the dumbest person in it, and the crowd is comprised of, you know, adolescent teenagers, what's the lowest common denominator of a bunch of like 13 to 15-year-old
malleability.
kids,
I mean,
yeah.
they're that much more reactive and that much more malleable, where they can literally take any. It just takes. So I want to paint a picture, right? Because we have at the beginning, right? We have history. We have the one individual, and then we have.
Are you gonna turn this into a monad thing?
No. So we have. Oh, I mean, maybe we have the monad, right? The one individual, and then it starts to multiply until you get. Right, we've talked about the psychological parameters of what constitutes a psychological crowd, right? So you have the one person, the one man, and he hooks up with other people, and you have a congregation of people now. So you have a group, you have this blob, you have a school of fish, if you will, right? A school of fish moves together, right? When there's a predator in its midst, you see them move together, bobbing and weaving. So think about that. We have this just collective hive mind of people. And I really want to carry it into what leads this group of people. So we have the ideas sparking, right? We have these effects that are sparking this movement of people coming together and wanting to march towards one singularity, if you will, right? Where they're all going to achieve whatever goal that is at the very end based on the influences on the outside. And this is where. So I wanted to finish this up at number 5, because these are the sentiments and morality of crowds. The morality of crowds, according to the suggestions under which they act, may be much lower or much higher than that of the individuals composing them. Explanation and examples. Crowds rarely guided by those considerations of interest which are most often the exclusive motives of the isolated individual. The moralizing role of crowds. So this is just a list that he put together of the sentiments and what influences crowds, really. So
well, there's a good distinction there too, because we've been talking about the mental common denominator of the crowd. This is how much a crowd itself can understand as its own organism. But he goes on to mention in that last part that just because the crowd might be thinking at a lower level doesn't mean that the lowest people in that crowd operating at that lowest level aren't capable of doing great things because they're part of this crowd. And this could include those heroic acts where you've got, a bunch of schlubs and procrastinators and people that necessarily might not follow through or do anything. Once they're part of a crowd, that might actually put them in position to where like they follow through on some act that actually does have some great, social change. Maybe like a law gets passed or some new sort of momentum starts taking over because they were part of that crowd and had place in it. Whereas as themselves, they wouldn't have done anything more than play Fortnite, that weekend. But now they were part of this big thing. So there's that sort of aspect to it. I think that's important to acknowledge.
Making sure my fucking tablet doesn't die here. And so what I wanted to get into, right? So you have all the aspects that you mentioned about what pushes this congregation of people to do whatever it is that they want to achieve, right?
And I've got a really scary modern example of this too. And just the word itself, consider this, but you've got large crowds of people that share maybe just one or two common interests. This is what defines a crowd, right?
Freemasons?
And hold on. It's going to be even worse than that. So you've got these large crowds that share common interests, and then you've got these outside forces, these kind of like elites that see these crowds and can influence them and sort of inject their influence on them and decide where these crowds go and what those crowds, like they define the goal of these crowds.
Mm-hmm.
And the most obvious example would be the concept of an influencer, right? What does every little kid in school want to do now? They want to be an influencer.
That's my next thing here, because we have income leaders, right? Le Bon proposed it is a leader of a crowd who communicates simplified ideas to the crowd, and by doing this, the leader unites the crowd together and stimulates it to act. And we have here 2 quotes. The majority of men, especially among the masses, do not possess clear and reasoned ideas on any subject, whatever outside their own speciality. The leaders serve them as guide. How numerous are the crowds that have heroically faced death for beliefs, ideas, and phrases that they scarcely understood. So we have, again, how you said, the influencers, the people who come in and they really take, and they're the poster child of these movements, right? These people.
And if you were to go and look at like a protest as an example of a crowd, in my mind, these are the guys that are holding that megaphone and that are saying, you know, like Mike
Alex
Check
Jones.
and everyone. Well, yeah, Alex Jones is a good example. Like where he shows up and he starts shouting in a megaphone, a crowd will inevitably form around him and fully, you know, becomes this crowd organism essentially with him as the head.
So we have here on the ideas that these leaders utilize to control these crowds, Le Bon writes, and I have a quote here, by many they are considered as natural forces, as supernatural powers. They evoke grandiose and vague images in men's minds, but this very vagueness that wraps them in obscurity augments their mysterious power. They are the mysterious divinities hidden behind the tabernacle, which the devout only approach in fear and trembling. Okay,
He's getting deep with
love
the
that.
esoteric references at this point.
Yes, so we have this person, right, with this super magical power. And I mean, you can really arguably say, regardless of the fact of, we know that Hitler was a piece of shit, but the way his charisma, the way that he would yell and his vibrato, right, the way he would control his breathing and his mannerisms while giving these crazy fucking speeches about fucked up shit that they were going to do to a certain group of people. People looked up to that. People were worshiping. They deified these people, and I use Hitler as one of them because, you know, a lot of people.
Well, this is a good example because now, because a lot of the time I'm reading this book, the crowd essentially is like enough people that I can see filling like a courtyard or something, right?
Mm-hmm.
Or like a big mall maybe. But like again, like Le Bon was read by not just tiny little, you know, middle people like me that are sort of like just living life, but also by these rulers of countries. So these same exact principles that would apply to 200 people in a courtyard applies to the entire country of Germany, or you know, if they're running and they're trying to like take over other countries, it applies to like the entire nation at some levels.
Well, because that's the thing, because I mean, this is what he's getting at ultimately, is that a nation can be a crowd. I mean, and
well, think about patriotism, right? Like the whole, like, you know, they hate us for our freedom. How easy
nationalism and all
and
that
how
shit, yeah.
how overly reductive and simplified is that? You know, you hate me because of my freedom. But that's such a common, you know, like patriotic nationalist sentiment that if you say it, everyone knows what you mean and they might be able to agree with it. And I would almost argue like that would be a crowd. People that can congregate around that concept and agree with it are in some way forming a crowd around it.
Yeah. So we have these leaders, right, that come out, and I'm trying to read my own fucking handwriting. Individuals who get so wrapped up in these obscure ideas start to accept these ideas as religion, even if they do not have any religious associations. And we have, a person is not religious solely when he worships a divinity, but when he puts all the resources of his mind, the complete submission of his will, and the whole-souled ardor of fanaticism at the service of a cause or an individual who becomes the goal and guide of his thoughts and actions. So, yikes. Shots fired. He's getting woo-woo. He's getting woo-woo because Le Bon also talks about simulacra, about how the masses adopt sometimes the opposite of their beliefs. So the reason I put this here is because he talks about, or at least in the lecture that I was listening to, atheism. Were it possible to induce the masses to adopt atheism, this belief would exhibit all the intolerant ardor of a religious sentiment, and its exterior forms would soon become a cult. So a cult.
How prophetic. I mean, this is like a great way of, I mean, the dude was telling the future 100 years. Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it makes total sense. It's just how the mass hysteria. So when you have the media, so people are taking these obscure ideas, no matter how crazy it is, right? About, you know, teaching children about sex and about becoming trannies at age of 4 or whatever and all this shit. They start taking these obscure, crazy ideas and they start accepting them. They start accepting no matter how crazy it is. And when you come and talk against that, you're ruled a conspiracy theorist, you're ruled a heretic, you're ruled whatever else is the opposite of what their ideology is that they have adopted through the simulacra that was presented to them, through these empty ideas, empty symbols that was presented to these people. So again, how you're saying this dude is talking that shit, bro. This dude is on some next level stuff.
Well, I read something else in that too, where, and I don't know if this is what he meant, but especially in that concept of like atheism and religion, and it made me wonder that if someone going into this crowd that has no concept of religion, right? They haven't been through and had like a religious experience and kind of been into that, like that cult worship mentality. If they don't recognize it for what it is, I wonder if someone that has a religious background could maybe pick up on that easier. Or for example, if you've got a very strong religious constitution yourself and something in the crowd conflicts with that, I wonder, is that like an extra defense for you where it's like, wait a minute, I already have these very firm religious beliefs that maybe don't make any sense, but they're mine, and this crowd is like conflicting with that. Is that something that happens, or is it maybe like I already know how religious thinking works and I can slip into that state of mind, and this is just another version of religious thinking, so let me just slip into the crowd's version of this religion at the moment? I mean, it's probably different for different people, but I wonder if he ever like dove into that, because I didn't read any of that through here.
Well, here's the thing, dude. Yeah, and again, I got a lot of stuff from I read the book, then I got lectures and stuff, so this is where I'm compiling everything. And you can use this crowd psychology in a religious organization as well. I mean, that's pretty much what it is. It's propaganda to make people believe what you present to them. I mean, that's what.
I mean, you can use this crowd psychology to Thanksgiving dinner with your family if you really wanted to. Start using that vibrato and like start pounding your fist on the table.
So I have here, I'm trying to weave this together. We have Chapter 3, the ideas, reasoning power.
Well, hold on. Before we jump to Chapter 3, I've got one more from Chapter 2 here.
Go ahead.
And this goes back into like that very static, linear, matter-of-fact way of thinking, and I love this one because this, to me, it goes back into that instruction manual style. And he says that a crowd thinks in images, and the image itself immediately calls up a series of other images having no logical connection to the first. We can easily conceive this state by thinking of the fantastic succession of ideas to which we are sometimes led by calling up in our minds any fact. Our reason shows us the incoherence there is in these images, but a crowd is blind to this truth and confuses the real event with the deforming action of its imagination superimposed thereon. So this goes into that same idea that a crowd doesn't stop to think and reflect. You could just like make up some, like a straw man's a good example. I could just like in a crowd make up a straw man, and there's that dude that's like, that guy kills babies, or just like some crazy shit.
Is that Moloch? Yeah, that's Moloch.
But if it evokes an actual visual image in their mind, and they know that it's not Moloch, right? Because Moloch's a fucking pagan god from history. He's not this politician that's in front of you. But the fact that someone says that's Moloch, you bring up the image of Moloch, you think of like, oh man, sacrificing children and pain and anguish and evil. And now all of those emotions around this fictional image that is not that guy, but the emotions that it brought up, you now attribute to that guy. And even though there's no logical connection between those, The crowd mentality bypasses that because they don't stop to think, oh, wait a minute, Moloch's a pagan god, and Moloch might be a fictional entity that's really a representation of, different emotions and things like that. But that process never exists. It just keeps going on to the next.
And on that, bro, because I have something on that. I have here. Sentiments are simple and exaggerated, right? And crowds only see things as a whole, so they don't focus on the intricate details of it. So we establish that they have an idea, right? The lizards give you an idea, and they break it down in the simplest form, even if it's a fraction of the original idea, to feed it to the pigs, right? To feed it to the sheep, to run with that, right? So they don't see things as a whole. And these leaders, they use embellished vocabulary is used to manipulate polarized morality. So some
also known as rhetoric. This is the skill of having rhetoric, knowing
yes.
what to say, how to say it, completely based on who you're talking to,
So you get polarized moralities, right? So you're either with us or you're against us. And crowds are incapable of reasoning. And at the beginning, he compares them to barbarians. Crowds only see in terms of images because of their imagination. Now, this is where I get to what you're getting at. And I don't know if it was Le Bon or not, because, again, I read this, then I started diving into some other extracurricular research with the lectures and videos and different videos and stuff. And as long as they have good theatrics, all is good to them. Now, this particular lecture that I was listening to, the guy talked about the Romans, about even when life is not so good, as long as they have good entertainment, good food, good entertainment, they fall into the illusion that all is good, regardless of the actual facts. They start to take this weird psychology of like, oh, okay, yeah, that's fine. No, as long as I have good entertainment, right? The Roman Empire is crumbling around us. There's inflation. There's all this shit.
Imagine this too. This is like, oh shit.
We got some good Marvel movies coming out though, Thomas.
Yeah, exactly. I just got a letter from the IRS. My job's cutting my hours. Like all these horrible things are happening. But fuck, bro, like the new Marvel series just dropped on Netflix.
The new Spider-Man, bro. The new Spider-Man movie.
But this isn't even that groundbreaking, right? This is the whole like bread and circus for the masses, and religion is the opiate, and just keeping people entertained.
Crowds do not reason; they only imagine. Okay, so they only imagine. This whole movement that they're going through. They have a great leader. They have a great person who's leading them with all these crazy, fucked up ideas, no matter how crazy they are. But they imagine this utopia, right? The end goal, the end all be all of where we're gonna get to because of this. So
that's what keeps them going. That's what keeps the crowd momentum going, is these ideals.
Yes.
And a scary. Here's another. He gets into this, and I don't know exactly how he describes it, but you imagine that each person in this crowd, to make it manageable, again, let's say it's like 100 people, right? Each of those 100 people in the crowd have a completely different version of what utopia means to them, yet they're all working towards what they perceive as like a shared utopia. But I mean, guaranteed 100 people collectively are not going to agree on like what the perfect society is. You know what I mean? Let alone like 3 people agree on
polarized moralities, the polarization, even within the crowd. You know what I mean? So...
But they can't acknowledge that because there's no time to step back and reflect and compare differences. So that you never stop to think, wait a minute, this utopia that I'm imagining might not be the same as that dude that's marching next to me that has that nasty looking tattoo on his arm or whatever, And
I have here, more times than not, crowds do fucked up shit a lot of the times, right?
Was that a direct quote from Le Bon?
No, that's a direct one from the One-on-One podcast. Although some crowds are not evil, and I have a quote here. Our savage, destructive instincts are the inheritance left dormant in all of us from the primitive ages. In the life of the isolated individual, it would be dangerous for him to gratify these instincts, while his absorption in an irresponsible crowd, in which, in consequence, he is assured of impunity, gives him entire liberty to follow them. So here we are in this crowd. Me and Thomas were at this neo-Nazi crowd that were protesting, for the rights for the neo-Nazis, whatever. And no matter what we do, we feel this sense of invincibility when we're in this crowd, right? Because it's almost like Kundalini, bro, where their mind morphs their body so they feel invincible. And you see this, bro. You see people being beat to death. You know, like some of these videos that came out from the Antifa riots and BLM and all these people, there was people being bloodied, bro, on the ground, like being like they were just ragdolling these people on the ground. Because why? Because when they're in this aura, right, this crazy aura that they're in, they feel this sense of that they don't have to take responsibility for their actions.
Well, and especially if they see one person do something that technically would normally get you arrested or, you know, in a lot of trouble, they see someone do that action and then not get immediately face the consequences of it. Then 2 people do it. And then once, you know, 3 people have done it,
Monkey
well,
see,
hell,
monkey do.
yeah, and this, I mean, you could correlate this to like the January 6th, right, where people are just like breaking into windows and entering the Capitol, and it's like, well, those 10 people did it. Why can't I do it? They didn't get in trouble. I mean, it might have taken them like a year and a half to get in trouble for it, but the crowd is not thinking that far in the future. They're not even thinking an hour into the future.
So we're rubbing shoulders with Carl Jung as well here, right? So I have a quote here by Carl Jung. If people crowd together and form a mob, then the daimonisms, I hopefully I said that right. The daimonisms, people on this episode
Dynamisms, like the
have learned,
dynamic aspects to the crowd.
people, if people have picked anything up from this episode that I can't fucking read. So dynamisms of the collective man are.
Hold on, let me just stop you really quick because I read this quote that I love that says that if someone ever mispronounces a word, never look down on them because it means they learned that word reading it and not having someone else repeat it to them. So
Thanks, Thomas.
never ever, you know, snicker at someone, oh, they didn't pronounce that right, because it meant they taught themselves that word and that's why they don't know how to pronounce it. And if anything, that might be more noble than just knowing what that word is automatically because they heard it from someone.
I'm noble as fuck. You hear that?
That's right,
people?
bro. That's right.
Thanks, dude. You're the best. So the collective man are let loose. So the dynamisms of a collective man are let loose. Beasts or demons that lie dormant in every person until he is part of a mob. Man in the mass sinks unconsciously to an inferior moral and intellectual level, to that level which is always there, below the threshold of consciousness, ready to break forth as soon as it is activated by the formation of a mass. Damn, bro, that's deep.
And the way I read this too, again, is almost like no one's gonna spontaneously become a genius in a moment, but anybody, even the smartest person in the world, can essentially devolve back into that primitive, pugilistic state of just being like a member of a crowd, and just like following their base instincts. And this is kind of what this is the common denominator.
So this ties into chapter 3, right? We have the idea of crowds, the reasoning power of crowds, the imagination of crowds. Did you have anything in chapter 3 that you wanted to add before we start moving in? Because I'm gonna skip chapter 4, a religious shape.
Yeah, so I got a couple from chapter 3 I want to get into.
Go ahead.
So here's a passage from chapter 3, and he says, and this is when he starts breaking things down into like more and more specific groups to analyze.
Yes.
He says, they, as in groups may be divided into 2 classes. In one we shall place accidental and passing ideas created by the influence of the moment, infatuation for an individual or a doctrine, for instance. In the other group will be classified fundamental ideas to which the environment, the laws of heredity, and public opinion give a very great stability. Such ideas are the religious beliefs of the past and the social and democratic ideas of today. And these 2 groups that he's kind of talking about is like one where the group and the individuals among it kind of form their own directive and like their own objectives. And the other type of a group is one that's almost tapping into this like genetic Akashic records of you know, like crowd mentality, that it's the public opinion that existed before you. It's your genes that existed before you. It's the national history of the location you live in that all existed before and outside of you, but these can also be these like large influences. So he's breaking again into these 2 categories of like individually formed groups that have their own individual goals, and then people that are kind of latching onto these larger movements that almost ripple through history. And I thought that was really interesting because, again, this yours points of like that supernatural, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
there's this ball of energy that just kind of represents like this historical unrest, and it's almost like if you just like walk by it, it's like latches
It's
on
the
to
Eye
you,
of
like,
Horus.
oh shit, like all of a sudden like I'm a super patriot now, I'm like angry at stuff, you know what I mean? Like I feel like that's kind of what he's describing here, is that people can get sucked into these crowds like unbeknownst to themselves almost.
Oof, that's scary, right? Because like, what if like it's like I don't want to say demonic, but it's almost like this force, right? Like like the force. I mean, you could either use it for good or for evil, essentially. You know what I
Well,
mean?
and again, as the instruction manual aspect of this, I mean, you could literally be using it for good or evil. Like, I'm going to use this crowd to do some really fucked up things. And here I got a couple others that I'm going to read. And sometimes I've got a page where like the whole page is fire, and I just put like stickers all over it. And I've got one of those coming up, but I'm just going to cherry pick some quotes. But he continues here. He says that it is arguments of this kind that are always presented to crowds by those who know how to manage them. Think about, this is the lizard, this is the Illuminati guy, knowing ahead of time what the crowd's capable of and only introducing the ideas that they think the crowd's capable of. So he says that they are only the arguments by which crowds are to be influenced. A chain of logical argumentation is totally incomprehensible to crowds, and for this reason it is permissible to say that they do not reason, or that they reason falsely, and they are not to be influenced by reasoning. On reading certain speeches, astonishment is felt at their weaknesses, yet they had an enormous influence on the crowds who listened to them, but it's forgotten that they were intended to persuade collectives and not to be read by philosophers. So again, like, you go back and find some large political speech, and at the time it might have revved up the entire country, and it started a
shit.
war and like, a whole
Yeah.
national movement. But 50 years later, you're reading it right on paper, and you're like, this is kind of fucking weak, and like some of this shit is just straight wrong. But
'Cause
that
of the
wasn't the
time.
point. Yeah, it was the time, but it was also the rhetoric. It wasn't the logic or the grammar in it. It was the rhetoric and the way that it was delivered, and the vibrato and the enunciation.
It makes
and
you think of all the
hand
famous
movements.
speeches of all time that have been given at
Well,
these
yeah,
revolutions.
remove that charismatic speaker and just read the words on the page. It's going to lose almost all of its meaning. You know what I mean? Like, it's
Wow.
that cadence, and it's the circumstance which adds
The
to-
atmosphere, right?
Yeah, it's all together. It does, like, these speeches don't exist in bubbles. So
There was
they
a
don't exist
slight
in
wind from the
vacuums.
northwest that day that you just really, just the guy's hair was just moving in the wind or some shit. You know what I mean? Like, really, I mean, you have to take all those things into consideration. How they say, oh, the planets aligned today. Well, I mean, that's literally what it is.
Another good example, I don't know if you remember this, but there was when Bernie Sanders was running for president, and I think he gave some speech, and like in the middle of the speech, like a dove or something came and like perched itself on his shoulder, or like on the
I know the fly
microphone
that
or
landed on Mike
something,
Pence's
or-
head. The
Yeah, well,
fly.
look, another great example, right? Where like this stupid, inconsequential, unrelated thing happens, but some people take it as like green language, or like this
Yeah.
was, a sign from the
Twilight
gods or
language,
something. But this is the kind of thinking where like it doesn't require a thought process. It's just like, oh, fly landed on head.
He's full
fly
of shit.
dirty. Fly evil.
Yeah.
Hence evil. Like these connections. Like they don't
Meanwhile, it's a
have to make
robotic
sense.
fly. Like, I'm gonna fucking land on this dude's fucking forehead right here, real
So
quick.
let me keep going before we go on too many tangents. So he says that crowds being only capable of thinking in images are only to be impressed by images.
There you go.
It is only images that terrify or attract them and become motives of action. And you kind of hinted on this already with like all the theatrics and like the grandiose movements. But again, he's trying to instill in so many different ways. He's saying the same thing, that a crowd is only going to listen to slogans, to rhyming phrases that are very easy to say, and to like the most simple images that they can just put in their mind's eye and focus on that thing. Utopia. It might just be like a really nice looking city from afar, and that's all they have to keep in their mind, and just say, okay, this vague abstract idea is utopia. They don't want to get into like, well, how does social services work in utopia? What if the natural resources are
they have
depleted at
healthcare?
certain like, no one's saying like, hey, does this utopia have healthcare? And is there a single payer system? And no one's saying that, you know. It's always just like, oh no, I'm thinking of this really cool fucking city in the future, and
What's the
that's what
tax
I'm
rate
marching
gonna be
for.
like, guys? Do you really think that we're gonna pull this off?
So that was all I had for chapter 3 so far.
And I want to point out it's chapter 3 of book 1 because it's 3 different books in this thing, and we're working our way through it. You know, just bullshitting. And I really wanted to touch on that these crowds use their imagination, and we have here when someone joins a crowd, they are motivated by the fact that when they are alone, they must take responsibility for their own life and actions. And I have a quote here: in crowds, the foolish, ignorant, and envious persons are freed from the sense of their insignificance and powerlessness, and are possessed instead by the notion of brutal and temporary but immense strength. And that's also Le Bon. And I didn't really dig into the whole racial aspect. I don't know if you have much on that. I wanted to skip chapter 4 as a religious shape assumed by the conviction of crowds, which, I mean, you could use your imagination again. More
I mean, he goes
symbology.
into like into nihilism and Dostoevsky, into Nietzsche, and what he's explaining this chapter without getting into the weeds, because yeah, this one gets a little bit deep, but it's making assumptions on how crowds react, how crowds form, their motives, based on the religions that they might
Yes.
follow or the religions that are in their regions. And this, like there's 2 ways to read I mean, there's a million ways to read it, but 2 main ways to read it is, one is like, oh, this dude is just grouping people into the most convenient labels so that he can continue on this theory. But I feel like he does go to some extent to try and justify why he's doing this, and some loose examples. I'm not going to read directly out of it, but he mentions that, like, if you're coming from a culture that is heavily based in like paganism and has a lot of pagan gods and pagan rituals and pagan ceremonies, then the same sort of like puritanical Christian motivations and criticisms might not apply. Like, you might not be able to rile a crowd up that is so steep in pagan religion the same way that you could rile a crowd up that is, you know, very much heavy in like a puritanical Christian aspect of things. Like, they're both crowds, they both share some common denominator, but what motivates them and what triggers them are going to be vastly different things. And I think that he then extrapolates this not just to religion, but to cultures, to regions, to like, if you just happen to grow up within 100 miles of a certain dynasty or, you know, like royalty, then that is going to affect you, whether you want to acknowledge it or not. That does have some play into your susceptibility to becoming part of one of these crowds.
You grew up listening to reggaeton like in the background, and you're like,
yeah,
that shit bangs, bro. Yeah, we're in Kissimmee, bro. We're in Kissimmee up in here. That's Little Bayamon there, Little Puerto Rico. So, you know what I mean? Yeah, and that's why I didn't want to get too lost in the weeds there. So if you want to learn the esoteric shit of how to control your neighbors and control your association, your homeowners association, just read that part, and you'll be able to be like, oh, I have Indian neighbors here, and I can do this, this, and this to really, you know, manipulate them. My other ones are Americans. They're white as fuck, so I can do this for them. And he really gets into that. And I wanted to touch on one of the things I was talking to you on the phone about the prestige, right? About because he mentions the prestige. He really nails it in your head like over and over and over again.
And I think when I read prestige in this context, I sort of translated that into the word rapport, which might have been a similar translation. I might be wrong on that, but like, because when we think of prestige, we're almost thinking of some title and elevation giving to you that makes you like elevated in some way.
But not only that,
higher.
dude, but symbols. So there was this lecture that I was getting into where, so remember, our conscious actions are led by our unconscious mind, okay? And he constantly refers to prestige. And I put on here, I relate that to Nietzsche's will to power in a way. There's a metaphysical aspect to the parasite within a congregated masses, which we didn't talk about the parasite, right? Where the parasite, it starts off with a suggestion. And just like a parasite or like a virus, it multiplies just based off that suggestion. Now, the suggestion really might be what you were talking about, that poof, you know, that one thing. It's like, let's suggest this, let's inject this thing in here, and from that sprouts, and you just have this complex neuron system that just connects over and over again. So it's like a cancer, pretty much. I mean, this, and he talked that this exists within congregations of people. Now, the prestige, you have what you're saying, right? Like, oh, something that signifies that I'm higher in the hierarchy of society than you. You have judges, right? Of back then, they had those fucking fake wigs, right? That they said it was used to hide syphilis and their baldness and all this shit. You have the judges with the robes, the Supreme Court, things that might be that dude with the megaphone and Alex Jones with the megaphone, you know, talking about turning the frogs gay and all this stuff here. Let me
Listen, you son of a bitch. Listen, fuckhead. I don't like them putting chemicals in the water that turn the friggin' frogs gay.
He's yelling. That megaphone might to them signify this prestige, the way that these people carry themselves, right? Because he kept saying prestige. And I'm like, what the fuck is this guy getting at with prestige? You know what I mean? So great power is given to ideas propagated by affirmation, repetition, and contagion. So he refers to the contagion by the circumstance that they acquire in time, that mysterious force known as prestige. So,
and these are like fucking definitions of logical fallacies. Like one of the big ones is appeal to authority. Like just the fact that the judge has the fancy wig and the robe on, whatever he says somehow has more power than someone not wearing the fancy wig. Just because he's got authority.
He's standing at a higher podium than you, looking down at you. Right. So again, this body language, like I'm standing on top of the car, talking down on you. So you have to look up to me, almost like some sort of false god. So, but he calls it this mysterious force. And in Nietzsche's will to power, the will to power is this, like thelema, right? Will is this thing that manifests itself differently within all men. So you can use it again, like the force, use it for good, use it for evil. Mind you, he's rubbing shoulders with Nietzsche. Okay, this is at the time towards Nietzsche's end. He was insane towards the last 15 years of his life, but that's besides the point. And he is talking about this mysterious force that Nietzsche talked about that eventually leads you to become the Ubermensch, which is this overman, this higher,
the Superman.
The Superman, exactly. So, and another one, right? What are superheroes? There are these symbols of, oh, look, they're super, they're extravagant. They can do more things than I can. They have superpowers. You know what I mean? Like let's worship them. They're almost gods. And the reason I bring this up is because, you know, this idea of the crowd contagion that really just spreads. You know, you have all these things coming together, and you know, you have admiration, you have fear, all at the same time.
These are all emotions to point out. These are all emotions.
Emotions, exactly. Prestige in reality is a sort of dominion exercised on our mind by an individual, a work, or an idea. This domination entirely paralyzes our critical faculties. I think I said that right. And fills our soul with astonishment and respect. So, again, it's these, and there's acquired prestige and personal prestige, but I want to focus on the fact that when you have this, right, you have the idea of Nietzsche's will to power, because not all hope is lost, right? I want to also say that, because this entire time we're like, hey, if you're part of a crowd, you're fucked. You know, there's no overcoming it. There's no, you know, breaking free of the system. There's, you know, once you're in a crowd, how you mentioned earlier, you're sucked in without your knowing. You don't know you're in there. But I want to point out that Le Bon, although we are always some part of a crowd at all times of our lives, Le Bon did believe that you were able to achieve some level of freedom, partial freedom and independence of some kind. And he says, Le Bon maintained the freedom was achievable by bringing forth the ideas, values, and beliefs that we let guide us in our lives. And he has here a quote: "The tyranny exercised unconsciously on men's mind is the only real tyranny because it cannot be fought against." So if you're able to break free of that mental prison and really see things for what they are and bring forth these ideas that your core values at its very core, you're able to see through the bullshit. I mean, that's what it really is. And you're able to become.
This amounts to, at some point, standing up against the crowd or getting up and leaving that crowd once you identify it. But if you don't have the ability to identify it in the first place, then you are kind of screwed.
Well, and that's what determines really, again, this prestige, right? If you either acquire it or you already have it, and you're almost able to break free. And I related this because I remember as I'm reading this, I'm thinking about Nietzsche, because I just did a deep dive on Nietzsche not too long ago. I'm thinking about him and his end goal, right? Because you mentioned nihilism and all this stuff. The overman is to defeat nihilism, to become his own, I don't want to say God, but pretty much become your own God and become and really dictate your own reality. Because Nietzsche, you know, the famous God is dead and we have killed him. We're the murderers of murderers and et cetera, et cetera. He's not celebrating the death of God. He's actually sad about it. And it's like, wait, a life without God, a life without purpose, a life without pursuit is bad. And that leads you to nihilism. So the overman is there to defeat nihilism. So to defeat the idea that nothing dictates nothing and it's just a vast emptiness. But I related this idea of the you know, being able to break free with this because again, not all hope is lost. Okay, that's what I'm trying to get at. There are ways to defeat this, and this is what we talk about, right? As conspiracy theorists and all this shit, that there is a way to really, what is they always say, realize or something like
Yeah,
that?
real eyes, realize, real lies. I don't say that often. I've seen it plenty, but yeah.
Or realize see or some shit like that. So I mean, if you're able,
for those who have the eyes to see it.
yes, and so we have this whole aspect that we've talked about the whole contagion, this unseen force and all this stuff. And I wanted to get to the crowd hallucinations. Did you get that? Did you pick up on that? The stories that he talked about?
Is this in chapter 4?
I don't know what chapter.
Are you reading ahead at this point?
Yeah, I'm just going based off of my notes. Did you have anything else in the chapters we could go over?
So in chapter 4, I did want to briefly mention, because in all the previous chapters in the first book, they all kind of start out when he has this like index of here's the topics that we're going to be getting into and a quick summary. He doesn't do that in chapter 4, but he does still have these distinct topics. So I just wanted to cover what he mentions, because I don't know if I agree or if I understood his perspective on all of these, so it's interesting to kind of cover them. So the very first one is the one that was the hardest for me to understand, I guess, because again, like I grew up in, I was born in the 1980s, not in the 1880s, and I also grew up in like America, and I sort of like had my coming of age like online with like a digital friends all across the world, and like I don't know if I had the exact same mentality as a person that was born in the 1800s that lived in a area and then traveled the world by like foot and very traditional means. The difference between cultures and races to that guy in the 1800s seem, worlds away from me in the 1980s going through metropolitan city, going to like Chicago and going to New York City as a kid. I don't think I had the same views, but with that in perspective, it was very important to him, and he even mentions race as being the number one factor for determining how a crowd acts. And I'm not going to read the whole section. I'm just going to give his first statement on it, just to show how important it was for him. And maybe we can talk. Maybe it makes more sense to you, but it didn't click as much for me. But he says that this factor, race, must be placed in the first rank, for in itself it far surpasses in importance all of the others. We have sufficiently studied it in another work, and he's talking about a previous book, I think it was called The Psychology of Peoples, and this is where he breaks down like different races and cultures. But he says that, therefore it's needless to deal with this again, but we showed in this previous volume what a historical race is, and how its character once formed, it possesses as a result the laws of heredity, power that its beliefs, institutions, and arts, in a word, all the elements of its civilization, are merely an outward expression of its genius. So he's now taking like an entire culture or an entire race and turning that into a group, and saying that group is sort of just embodies. And when he says all the elements of civilization and its genius, it's kind of like all the stereotypes that most people assume that are related to this
Puerto Ricans
group.
are lazy. Yeah.
He puts it in very nice floral language of like heredity and genius and elements of civilization. But yeah, he's talking about just complete stereotypes, and he's mentioning this as the number one factor. And again, this one was hard for me to assume because I feel like
Because you're white, bro. It's all right.
Well, yeah, because I'm white and I guess I'm already homogenous and I'm part of this like unknown sludge of like Anglo-Saxon wasp, culminations. But like he clearly thought this was important, and the other people that followed this book clearly took note of that.
Yes.
His next one is so the first one was race. Second one is traditions, and he says that traditions represent ideas, needs, and sentiments of the past. They are the synthesis of race and weigh upon us with immense force. The biological sciences have been transformed since embryology has shown the immense influence of the past on the evolution of human things. Now, I don't know why he brings up embryology here as if there's like a... Go ahead.
Because it's been scientific. I mean, I don't know at the time, but it's been scientifically proven that fears and ideas are passed down genetically. And I don't know if it was you that I was on a podcast with, but have you ever heard of the flea experiment? The fleas in the jar?
I don't think so, no.
So when you take a group of fleas, right, and you throw them in a jar and you seal the jar up, right? The fleas are trying to constantly jump out. Boom, 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 trying to jump out, trying to jump out, trying to jump out. You come back the next day, just 24 hours later, and you open up that jar, the fleas have been trained to only jump so high. They're not able to break out of that firmament that the cap formed. And you can take the fleas out of the jar and they will only jump as high as that where they had originally been in that jar, up and hitting that cap. And those fleas and their offspring offspring will only be able to jump as high as they were able to jump. So it proves scientifically, number one, that fears, right? We have the boogeyman that we introduce to kids to make them go to sleep at night. These fears, we have the chickens, when you flash different shapes above their head, they don't react if you flash a circle, a square, a triangle. But as soon as you flash an eagle, the silhouette of an eagle, they fucking flip out. Mm-hmm. So these, because again, from the embryo, they said that literally and I'm having a kid next month. So they said that the most important part of the development of a child is not outside the womb, is in the embryo. It's when it first starts out in the mother's womb, inside her body, not on the outside. Oh, and you go, well, you mean you can influence them on the outside, but you'd be surprised to see how much they really take in subconsciously, even while they're inside the womb at all times for those 9 months. And I mean, so maybe he's hinting at that. You know what I mean? That's the way I saw it.
That's easy for me to relate to. Like I'm not a biologist or psychologist or anything.
Neither am I. I'm just.
I
full
definitely
of shit.
believe though. Like yeah, we're both full of shit essentially. but back to that quote where he said that you're looking at the surface of the waves and that pattern is this complicated thing that's happening deep below. I mean that essentially to me is saying that there's all of these generations of tradition that have shaped your desires and your fears, back through your
for no
ancestors.
reason, because we don't know. We just follow it. It's tradition. Exactly.
Well,
you know what I mean?
These are like those movements in the depths that we have absolutely no knowledge
Control
of.
over,
And the waves are like how we react to things in
Cthulhu.
The current time. It's Cthulhu. Always goes back to Cthulhu. So the next one, so he starts out with race, then he says that the next biggest factor is tradition. He's kind of going in order of like how important these different elements are to the crowd.
To note, Thomas, this is chapter 1 of book 2, by the way.
Well, no, this is. Well, I'm reading from chapter 4 of book 1.
Really?
Yeah, religious shape assumed by all the convictions of crowds.
Shit. Well, because he gets in depth into it in chapter 1.
So he starts with race. He goes on the tradition. The third one is time, and he says that in social as in biological problems, time is one of the most energetic factors. It's the sole creator and the sole great destroyer. It is time that has made mountains with grains of sand and raised the obscure cell of geological eras to human dignity. He's talking about the primordial slime evolving into, the human intellect as being time. The action of centuries is sufficient to transform any given phenomenon. And it has been justly observed that an ant with enough time at its disposal could level Mount Blanc. So he's just saying, I mean, this is another one of my favorite ways of this on an infinite timeline. Like a room full of monkeys and typewriters could recreate the entire works of William Shakespeare. It's sort of like time is this infinite resource that if you could actually utilize all of its infinite possibilities, anything is possible, including, as he literally says here, an ant could level a mountain. which, you know, it's hyperbole, but it makes a lot of sense when you're talking about how important time is.
Yeah, because I mean, a droplet of water can really break and weather away at stone with enough time. You know what I mean? That's literally how rivers are formed. I mean, just water pushing through and pushing through. So it makes it's a how you said, it's a nice way to embellish it and really put it into a digestible form, or like a little poem, if you will.
So he goes on too, and he mentions political and social sentiments, and then he says of instruction and education. And this is where we were talking before about teachers in school and indoctrination and how they can kind of like shape the people that are going to eventually form these crowds in the future. And he says that foremost among the dominant ideas of the present epoch is to be found the notion that instruction is capable of considerably changing men, and has for it unfailing consequence to improve them and even make them equal. This is that concept of like just teach the children and they can all rise and kind of become the same, capability. But he says, by the mere fact of it being constantly repeated, this assertion has ended by becoming one of the most steadfast democratic dogmas. It would be as difficult now to attack it as it would have been merely to have attacked the dogmas of the church. And again, like he's steeped in this like 1890s rhetoric and the way that he's describing this. But as I'm reading this in modern terms, I translate it to teachers are looked upon with all this dignity and prestige, and you can't even criticize the teaching profession or teachers without looking like this asshole, absolute asshole. And again, he likens it to attacking the dogmas of the church. And again, in the 1800s, thinking back to like the 1700s, attacking the dogmas of a church is not the same as like 2020 attacking the dogmas of a church, where it's like the status quo. You know, you get a blue check mark and all sorts of Reddit awards if you criticize religion.
Freedom of speech. You know, we have all this shit.
But again, in the 1800s, he's talking about like, you can't say anything bad about teachers because everyone's going to hate you for it. And little does he know that sentiment only increases over time, to where it might be at one of its biggest heights right now.
I mean, it morphs. So I took that as it morphs as time goes on, right? These teachers become these conglomerates and these other establishments that really take, you know what I mean? Like it turns into something bigger and bigger and bigger. And if you talk against, right, the biggest power back then was the church. If you went against them, you were ruled a heretic, you were exiled, and you were sometimes even killed and burned at the stake. But nowadays, it's like, oh, well, you're going to go against the mainstream narrative? Who are you? What's your prestige to be able to talk down on the church, you fuck?
I think you could make a decent argument that previously the church was sort of like that massive global conglomerate, and you couldn't go against the church.
Exactly.
But right now in 2022, I would almost argue that the public education system has fully replaced that concept of like church dogmas. And now, the single public education system as a whole, as one unit, I think probably has more power and more dogmatic principles than all the various religions that still sort of exist in their different denominations. I love this. I'm already biased towards someone that's critical of public education and teaching and stuff. So, but he goes on, and I love this. He mentions that it's hard to pick the different passages because there's so many here. But he says the primary danger of this system of education, very properly qualified as Latin, consists in the fact that it is based on the fundamental psychological error that intelligence is developed by learning by heart of textbooks. Adopting this view, the endeavor has been made to enforce a knowledge of as many handbooks as possible. From primary school till he leaves the university, a young man does nothing but acquire books by heart without his judgment or personal initiative being ever called into play. Education consists for him in reciting by heart and obeying. Again, 1800s, and Repetition. This guy's talking about how that the education system is a danger because they're just telling you what to read and having you read it and recite it and say back exactly what I want you to say back to me, and don't go and pick out your own books and don't go and do your own studies and come up with your own independent ideas. Just, recite back what I already know and what I expectingly hear because It standardizes you. It makes my job easier. It gives me an easier rubric on how to judge you as a person intellectually. Did you finish these answers and mark them correctly versus, man, you just had a very independent and creative thought and you've been able to think through it and come up with this idea. There's not enough time for that. And if you want to liken this back to crowd, right? Like almost a classroom as a crowd, you can't necessarily rely on this high level justifications and logic and thinking things through. Obviously, in an academic setting, there's a little bit more leniency towards explaining things in depth, but still in that crowd, you have to cater to that lowest common denominator and enter again, this whole issue of public education.
You have to go at the pace of the lowest intellectual kid in that class. So It goes back to the whole crowd mentality, because the whole class can move on, but if remember that one kid that would never really get it before the teacher moved on, and the teacher had to spend some extra time on him.
And you spent another week reviewing that chapter, and then you didn't catch up. And then also in school now, you've got remedial classes where they try to isolate those kids that slow the class down. They all put them into remedial classes. Then they got the normal class, which is where everyone kind of fits in the middle. Then they have, in some cases, like gifted or challenge programs where it's like slightly more difficult versions. And then you've got like AP level where it's, you're almost taking college classes in the middle of high school. But these four ways of separating people, again, it's separating them in the crowd so that AP group of students isn't necessarily adhering to the lowest common denominator of the remedial students. But in my mind, it's kind of a fucked up way of doing it, because
it is.
Instead of addressing the fact that everyone might learn at a different rate and that you can teach, the same lesson differently to different people in the same setting, it's like, no, the answer here is to like put all the dummies together and all the smart people together and treat them as though they're equals. Because you're never going to find that like homeostasis in people, no two people are ever going to be alike like that.
What else you got on there, dude? So we can link it up to the hallucinations. That really fascinated me.
So the final thing that I've got is just the last statement from chapter 4, which is the conclusion to book 1. And he says, he's kind of like asking some rhetorical questions here. He says, have we digressed in what proceeds from psychology of crowds? Assuredly not. If we desire to understand the ideas and beliefs that are germinating today in the masses and will spring up tomorrow, it's necessary to know how the ground has been prepared. The instruction given the youth of a country allows a knowledge of what that country will be one day. The education accorded to the present generation justifies the most gloomy provisions. It is in part by instruction and education that the mind of the masses is improved or deteriorated. It was necessary in consequence to show how this mind has been fashioned. And again, he's going into, have you ever heard of the Fabian Society?
Mm-mm.
So the Fabian Society, without going on a crazy tangent, their symbol is, their logo is literally a wolf in sheep's clothing. And this society kind of came together, and what made them unique is that they planned things out 50 and 100 years in advance in ways that they have actually taken effect. So this isn't just like a small group of people that are doing these immediate things. Fabian Society represents this very slow, very like planned version of molding the future. And he's kind of linking in my mind this concept of like public education and statewide education to something like this Fabian Society, where you consciously know, hey, if I instill these ideas in the youth and then follow them and help them adapt those ideas as they get into adulthood, like that whole like youth is the future. Well, like let's instill the ideas that we know we want them to have in the future. And to make an even wider correlation here, like the Hegelian dialectic, where you've got the
problem,
the thesis, the antithesis, and the synthesis. So again, in the concept of Fabian Society, in the concept of planting ideas in public education for the youth, it's like, I've got this thesis, and I can develop the opposite version of that, control both of them in this education system, wait 50 years or whatever for these kids to grow up and start conflicts over these different ideas that we've planted in them. And now when they're in a conflict, we already know like what their grievances are and what their approaches are because we gave them those.
We wrote the
you know,
manual.
yeah, we wrote their manuals, and now we're like, well, we can give you guys the perfect answer because like we know all the buzzwords, we know what got you pissed off, so here's the perfect solution for this. And that just, it's this repeating sort of formula that goes over and over. And it might seem like connecting these wild dots, but again, if we go back to this constant theme where he's talking about this elite class that sort of stands above the crowds and is able to control them, I mean, that's, again, this is a manual for somebody. It's not a manual for the dummy that's in the crowd that's the lowest common denominator. This is the manual that was written for that prestigious elite that he keeps talking about.
And if they didn't read it, they definitely understood the psychology of these crowds to begin with. So absolutely. I mean, you see that all throughout history. It's problem, it's idea, problem, solution, idea, problem, solution over and over and over and over again. And I mean, that's the way it's always been since the beginning of time. You know what I mean? And it's formed these sects within society of stuff, right? Like the generation before had completely different ideas than the generation now. So now they're fighting with the generation from before, and they're passing all these laws in favor of one group. But then the other group is getting pissed off because, hey, I don't want to identify as a toaster. I grew up Christian Pentecostal. I'm not a toaster. I'm a real boy.
It's just that pendulum that just keeps swinging from one extreme to the other, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I've got another even more simplified version of that Hegelian dialectic, which is a little bit of a stretch, but because it's such like a high level concept that people have written like volumes of books on just this one concept. But another way that I like to think of it is, in like every cheesy kids movie or like cartoons, there's this plot of like a guy wants to impress a girl or a guy wants to impress somebody else, so they like stage a mugging. They have their friend like mug this person, and then they come in and they save the day and they like defeat the mugger and they give the person their purse back or whatever, so they become this hero. And in my mind, that's like the most oversimplified version of this Hegelian dialectic, where there's the thesis and the antithesis. This is the robber attacking and then the hero coming to stop the robber. And then the synthesis is essentially like, hey, is there a reward involved here? Or it's like, hey, can we go out on a date because I just saved your life? Or some other version of that where it's like, I already knew what the conflict was going to be. I knew what the resolution of that conflict was going to be. And because I have full control over both of those dynamics, I also get to somehow influence the outcome of when those things come together and get resolved in the form of like, hey, I was the good guy here, give me my credit, whether it's a reward or my name in the paper or a date or whatever. Very oversimplified, but I feel like that's a decent description of this concept of creating the problem, having the solution, and then being the one in control of both of them.
You got anything else that you wanted to point out?
Just that book 2 is probably going to be even deeper than book 1 was.
I'm trying to find where they're talking about the murder of the little girls and then the story about the ship, unless that was the...
We got to leave a little bit of icing on the cake for the next one, right?
Yeah. So I wanted to get into So there's a story that these little girls were drowned, right? And it wasn't true. It turned out that the entire family and the entire town, right, because the mom identified like it was like a bracelet or something on the little girls, or like a scar or something. And again, the crowd contagion, the collective, they all hallucinated all together through suggestion. And it started off with the one person that was like, hey, wait, I recognize that little girl or these little girls. And they had this funeral and everything. And then it turns out after the fact, the little girls showed up, the ones that were missing, they weren't dead. It was a collective hallucination through the crowd because of the contagion that made all these people believe that these little girls were actually dead when they actually weren't. And there's another one, Julian Felix. He was a naval lieutenant and he wrote the book Sea Currents. And it talks about how the crew saw a ship, right? They were looking for the remnants of this other ship. And the people saw, the entire crew saw in the distance people waving and shit, like, oh. And the watcher that was at the top of the ship was like, hey, look down there. That's the suggestion. That's the suggestion over there. So they all start seeing these people on the ship waving, and even then some of them started to hear them calling to them like, oh, I hear them calling. When they pull up to the whatever it was that they were looking at, it was just a bunch of branches just put together. It was just, but again, through suggestion, through the contagion as a collective, they all hallucinated because of the influence of one person. Again, so you have the one person influencing them. Sometimes, not all the time, are they these prestigious people, but it just takes that one little spark, the one little idea to really stir up the pot and make everybody believe. And I mean, you see that now. I mean, like, oh, look at the COVID narrative. Oh, the people in China are falling in the streets. Where the fuck were all those people falling in the street here? The mask narrative. Well, if he's wearing a mask, I'm going to wear a mask. So they all start wearing masks, not trusting the science. No, fuck the science. This science says that it helps. This other science says it doesn't, whatever, but through Fauci, through the NIH, through these aristocracies that are at the top looking down, dictating where these crowds are going to go, people are believing and literally falling in line with the ideology that they're trying to push. Plus you have the media also, putting these seeds in of suggestions and things in there, and people take it for 100% true, and they start to hallucinate.
You could easily start bringing this into like was it Project Bluebeam, which is where NASA or whoever stages like the next coming of Christ or an alien invasion. I mean, that could essentially be NASA in that case, is that person on the Bird's Watch looking down and saying, hey, look, there's people down there. This is NASA being
there's
like, hey,
aliens.
Look, there's aliens coming. Yeah. And all it might take is, I mean, if you go back and look at like the MK Ultra records, I think from like the 50s when they were actually trying some of this stuff out, they were just going to say that it was Jesus and then just light a bunch of fireworks and stuff off. And they were sort of relying on implanting that suggestion, and then people seeing the fireworks, and then those people themselves coming to the conclusion, oh, this is the second coming, or this is an alien invasion, and then that creating this like mass panic.
Yeah, again, this mass hallucination of, and I think that's really how some conspiracies are also born, where you have again, unfortunately, I might be a heretic for saying this, but It's a collective. It's a collective of people that would come together, and we talk about this shit all the time, and we start to believe these things. But how I mentioned earlier, that's why I always say that you need to have some healthy skepticism. And that's what I like about talking to you, Thomas, where you challenge my ideas and call me out on my shit. It's like, well, where'd you get that from? Well, dude, it's just a conspiracy. Nah, bro, you can't just put this shit out.
You'll say something and nothing, man. That actually sounds like bullshit, and I want to know where you found it, and I'm gonna look it up for you and let you know. Yeah.
But you know what I mean?
Well, another good version of this too is like, consider if we went on a show and it was 9 conspiracy theorists and we were having a round table on flat Earth or something, and 8 of those people fully embraced flat Earth. I'll tell you, just from my own psychology, I might not be the one out of the 9 that's like shitting all over flat Earth theories. If anything, I might in that situation be more receptive and like, okay, well, since the crowd that I'm in right now is fully invested in this flat Earth theory, I'm gonna talk about the ways that I think it's, maybe like ways that it makes sense to me, or certain aspects that feel like they are, deserve a little bit more research or introspection. But again, like that crowd setting, being a crowd, it's not the crowd that's like, hey, let's stop for a second and just think for 20 minutes. Is flat Earth actually makes sense? Like, what's the rational logic in that? It's not very frequent that kind of discussion would come up, because the sort of the topic and the people that comprised of that crowd or in that round table, they already sort of represent this mass, hallucination or whatever they're always going to go into. I mean, it's the same aspect of like groupthink and mass psychology, where you see the examples where like an elevator opens up and like 5 people are facing like the opposite direction, and the dude walks in and like they also face, they face the wall or something. It's just this group suggestion where you don't want to feel like that person in the tribe that's about to get kicked out and starve to death. It taps into this very primal need to kind of fit in. And I feel like this has a huge impact on this like group hallucination that you're mentioning.
Yeah, yeah, and it's very easy to get lost in the sauce, right? Because I mean, it all sounds
That's a good way to
cool.
put it. Yeah, lost in the sauce.
Because it sounds cool, right? Like I like the whole idea of these lizard people and all this shit, but does it, like how you said, does it really make sense if you step back and start looking at the bigger picture? Doesn't make sense, but the embellishment of this language, of this idea of, oh, it sounds fucking awesome. It's, you can dismiss everything else. And
Well, I would say that another more practical way is stepping back and recognize, hey, if this topic came up, and if the people are talking about it in these very visual ways and these very emotional ways, and they're using rhetoric and straw mans and things, like, again, if you know your logical fallacies, you can see these as they're coming at you and be like, wait a minute, like, I understand the sentiment behind that statement, but it doesn't actually make sense if you break it down. You can't bring that up in the crowd, but you can think that in your own mind,
yeah, if you get to that point, if you're able to do that. Did you have anything else you wanted to add? I think we covered pretty much a lot of the bases. I didn't really get into the whole race thing because, like you said, it gets pretty convoluted, and he starts talking about.
Well,
the
and he's
Anglo-Saxons
referencing certain dynamics from the 1800s, and I'm not enough of an international historian to really relate to the things that he's saying. I understand the concept behind it, but I don't understand when he says that, like, Spaniards won't be like, I'm just making like an example up here, but he says something like Spaniards might not be as resistant to like violent revolution versus like the Dutch or something. And like, to me, I don't understand that. I can't process it because it was so far removed from me.
What do you rate this book, bro? Do you think it's I mean, I enjoyed reading it. I think it was aside from all the big words that I don't know, I think it was a pretty easy read. And I think I mean I learned a lot from really diving into this, and I see it from a different picture now. And it's a lot of the things that we've talked about, but now it actually has a name to it. You know what I mean? Like, now the voice has a face to it, type of thing.
Yeah, so the thing that impresses me the most too is that constantly I have to read this and be like, this is over 100 years old, well over 100 years old, the things he's writing. And this again was the third book that he worked on, which is sort of built on top of the first two, which I think he started in like the 1860s or something. So again, like, the level of insight that this guy has and some of these profound conclusions he comes up with seem way far ahead of his time. And that's probably the thing that impresses me the most about this whole book.
What would you rate it?
I don't like to do number scores. I'll just be like, is it worth skimming? Is it worth reading the entire thing? Or is it worth buying and having a copy of? I would rate it's worth reading the entire thing. You might not necessarily need to like own a copy and refer back to it. I really do think it's a book that you could read one time in, completely, and it'll instill itself into your brain. It's not information that is so abstract that you're going to forget it in a month. A lot of these concepts will just like latch into your brain, and I really do think, like, you read it in 10 years from then, you might see yourself in a crowd and be like, oh shit, this is a Gustave Le Bon moment. Let me back up, or, something like that will just be like almost through osmosis. It'll just be part of your knowledge. So, yeah, on my rating from skim it, read it, buy it, I say read it.
And I thought it was necessary, right? Because this show's about these obscure books. I had never heard about this until obviously the Freemason pointed it out to me. I was like, hey, you want to manipulate some people today? And I'm like, what are you talking about, bro? So obviously I got into it, but I agree with you. I think it is a book that you should actually read, not so much skim through, because he throws in these curveballs where you're like, damn, that sounded really good. I love the way that he put that. And there are a lot of ideas in here that, again, can get very convoluted when you start putting race into it, and he starts talking about how certain people are able to be more manipulated than others. But it was, again, a product of its time. So you also have to keep that in mind. And dynamics have changed even nowadays. So who knows if a lot of these things still are relevant today, but it has changed a little bit. So that's why I wanted to really talk about it on the show, because, we're the Occult Book Club. This is a more of an esoteric book because it focuses on a certain bank of knowledge, if you will, right? The certain aspect, which that's what esoteric is. It's knowledge on a certain specific topic that is not, maybe not the regular layman may be able to understand. That one weak link in the group may be able to understand. And not until you had brought it up to me did I hear about this, and I think it's fucking fascinating. What do you feel that we should do next as far as covering? What's the next book that you had in mind, if you had any?
So far we've been kind of focused on these public domain 100 years old or longer, so that we can just straight read passages out of them and not have to worry about copyright and stuff. But I absolutely want to do maybe some more formal book reviews of slightly more modern books. I brought up The Art of Memory by Francis Yates with you. That would be a fucking amazing one. There's one called Practical Magic, I think, by Richard Bandler, which is an NLP book, and it breaks down like if you were to take the crowd and say, okay, this is a manual on how to control crowds, you can take the Practical Magic, the NLP book, as an instruction manual on how to control your own brain and to change your emotions and your mentality based on what you want in the moment, on context, almost like a computer program, just like hitting a function. So I would love to get into those, although those are from the 50s through the 70s, I think. So we wouldn't be able to just straight read verbatim passages. We'd have to sort of come up with some notes and then, cover what we gathered from them. But I think I really want to go on some of those directions, because I wonder how many people listening have ever even heard of The Art of Memory by Francis Yates, and I find it one of the most fucking mind-blowing books that you can read today.
Yeah, I think for the next one, dude, I think we should read the entire work as a whole, and then you focus on XYZ and I focus on XYZ. That way we're not jumping over each other. You know what I mean? We read the whole thing, but then I'm going to focus on chapters 1 through 5 or whatever, and you focus on chapters 5 through 10. Tell me what you liked in the stuff while I'm reviewing it, and then I'll tell you the stuff that I liked on your stuff while you're reviewing it. That way we don't step on each other's toes, and there's a little bit more structure to it than... Because, I mean, I like jumping around, too, because it's all relevant. Like, that's the problem with it. Like, if I could highlight...
Well, I find we usually hone in on, like, the exact same... Like, out of all the hundreds of pages in here, like, there were 3 or 4 where, like, we both wanted to read the same passage because it both spoke to us, you know what I mean?
Yeah, because...
I agree with that.
It's fascinating. So, yeah, we'll see what we do next. And I really enjoyed this episode. Almost 3 hours of just... Again, I mean, this is a manual. If you want to learn to control people and really dig into the psyche of individuals, I mean,
and I always read these too as self-defense books. Like, now that I know how this works, I can use this for self-defense. Not
Probably
necessarily.
won't work on you.
I'm not going to go out and start commanding crowds because I don't have any crowds at my disposal yet. But now at least I can see when these techniques are being used against me.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. You need to. It's one thing knowing that you're in a game versus when you don't know you're in a game. So I absolutely agree with you that these pieces of work are crucial to be able to really decipher the matrix, if you will, and really see through the bullshit and not be manipulated and fall into that category of the weakest link in the crowd. So if you guys want to check it out, it's The Crowd, A Study of the Popular Mind by Gustave Le Bon, written in 1896. Very, very in-depth, and I really enjoyed it, dude. I enjoyed this, and I think this one awesome.
I hope that someone else out there end up reading part of this book and having their mind blown too, because it feels like a very obscure book that no one would come across unless it was pointed out to them specifically.
Unless you're a Freemason, yeah, absolutely.
Unless you're a Freemason, that's required reading on the first week, yeah.
You want to plug your shit, Thomas? For
once
those
again,
that stuck with us this long?
ParanoidAmerican.com. You can read a whole bunch of free comics, see a bunch of crazy conspiracy theory related artwork. I'm talking JFK assassination pinups. We're talking posters with Disney and Nazis that explain the whole backstory of Disney as an undercover FBI agent, all in one picture. We've got posters of Aleister Crowley and George Bush and Barbara Bush as a nice little Father's Day get-together. I've got MK Ultra pamphlets. We've got comic books about time traveling, conspiracy theories, and books about taking psychedelics and meeting ancient philosophers. So if any of that sounds interesting at all to you, ParanoidAmerican.com, and then Paranoid American on Instagram.
Awesome. Make sure to follow me on social media at the 101 Podcast on all social media platforms. Patreon.com/the 101 Podcast. Rockfin. Join the Telegram. All the links will be in the description. And thank you again, Thomas. We'll plan for the next one. And I'll see you guys on the other side.
Peace.
Bye.